This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. Supreme Court currently ruling on that Rwanda policy. And do you know, it is... I was going to come on air in a slightly cocky mode this morning and congratulate myself for having given you the facts that you need. But in the opening comments from the head of the Supreme Court, I've had some of my own ignorance highlighted because I thought... I think this is significant. I know it's a little bit self-referential, for which I apologise. But I thought that the applications were going to be processed according to the British system, even though they'd then stay in Rwanda. I don't know why I thought that. At least I'm not as daft as Ian Duncan Smith, who thought that if the application was successful, you'd then come back to the UK as a refugee. In fact, quite a lot of people persisted in that belief. In fact, you might still hold that belief now. So if they are deported to Rwanda and their application for asylum is processed and they are found to be bona fide refugees, genuine fleers of torture and misery and worse, they stay in Rwanda. I suspect that there are still a significant number of people listening to this who don't understand that. And I was going to be a bit smug about it until I listened to those opening comments. Because they don't. The application is according to Rwandan asylum applications or Rwandan asylum law. Guess how many asylum decisions Rwanda took in 2021? Just have a guess. Go on. Say a number out loud. Not if you're on the bus or something. People will think you're weird. 487, right? In 2021. And as of July 2023, how many cases in the UK asylum system backlog do you think there were? 136,779. And a significant number of the people watching this verdict today, watching this judgment today, think that either successful applicants who are offshored will come here in the event of their application turning out to be sound, or as I did, that they were being judged by the British criteria for asylum, even though I understood that they would be staying in Rwanda. So we're just adding to the Rwandan burden of asylum applications. And Rwanda is a country where, as we discovered yesterday, they were still kidnapping and torturing political opponents until very recently. How do we know that? We spoke to their daughter, Corinne Kanimba, yesterday. And where in 2018, they shot 12 refugees dead who had the audacity to protest, I think it was about food rations. The authorities in Rwanda have still failed to release their investigations of the fatal shooting of 12 refugees by police in February 2018. So we will watch that with interest. But we move first to the question that in many ways underpins it, and the human being, and I use the words advisedly, who has in many ways become the embodiment of this policy, a policy that I think relies upon a failure of understanding. I can say that now without sounding smug, because I failed to understand one quite significant element of it, even as supporters of the government were marching around studios describing it completely inaccurately as something that would see successful applicants return to the United Kingdom. It's Suella Braverman's baby. She didn't come up with it. She inherited it, didn't she, from Priti Patel? And whoever thought we'd sit here feeling almost wistful for the days of Priti Patel's tenure as Home Secretary, because Suella Braverman took the office to such unplumbed depths. And it was she who said, Braverman, who said that she dreamt about... That was such a weird thing to say. Is it sexist to hold off on criticising someone because they're a woman? Is it like a form of reverse sexism, inverse sexism? If Suella Braverman was a man, my goodness me, I could talk uninterrupted until 1 o'clock about how dreadful and awful. But I've just got this. It's probably my mum's fault. I just have this sort of weird chivalry. If that's the, and I'm blaming my mum now. That's even worse. Oh my God, it's like misogyny o'clock in the studio this morning. But my mum raised me to be very respectful of women, and so I find myself, even with someone utterly deserving of the utmost rancour, a Dorries perhaps, a Jenkins or a Braverman, there's a little bit of me that thinks, well, I can't describe them in the terms that I would use if I was talking about a man. But my God, she's gross, isn't she? Just gross. That, I mean, listen, whatever your views on a an asylum policy or an immigration policy may be, you don't lie in bed dreaming of people being deported. And presumably she understood, although I wouldn't say this with 100% certainty. I'm not sure this is a guaranteed observation, but you would hope that she understood what the policy actually was. She understood that we were hoping to deport people to an obviously unsafe country, whatever the judge decides today, whatever the court decides today. She was dreaming of deporting people. She was dreaming of deporting people who may well be bona fide refugees to a country where refugees 5 years ago were getting shot dead by police, and 2 or 3 years ago where opponents of the government were being kidnapped and tortured. She was dreaming of doing that. So you take someone who's fled Afghanistan, or someone who's fled Syria, or someone who has fled persecution anywhere in the world, and they manage to get to the UK because they've got family here. Suella Braverman doesn't just want to round them up and send them to Rwanda, regardless of how credible their claim may be. Suella Braverman dreams about it. I think, crikey, it was a new low, that, wasn't it? It was a new low. But we will park that for the time being and return to the Supreme Court when the current decision is clarified. I will talk instead about the broader problem of Suella Braverman. Here's the bit I don't get. And it was quite odd to hear Kwasi Kwarteng, who, in my very, very humble opinion, should be, I think, denying us the pleasures of his public pronouncements for at least another decade. You wonder what you have to do. What do you do for a living? What would be, for you, in your job, what would be the most catastrophic thing you could possibly preside over? For me, it would either be having a huge potty-mouthed outburst that somehow bypassed the dump button, or libelling somebody really, really popular and beloved. So if you came on air this time last year, or no, not this time last year, you came on air 2 or 3 years ago and libelled Captain Tom. Could you imagine the trouble that I would get into if I had done that? I never wanted to do that. I'm just trying to think, what's the worst thing I could do in my job? Listen, in statistical terms, I could hemorrhage listeners. I could wave goodbye to the hundreds of thousands of people who tune into this programme. I could just somehow contrive to get rid of all of them. So my boss would sit me down at the end of a Rajar quarter, we call them, and he'd say, well, James, he's a lovely bloke, my boss. He delivers, he's never had to deliver bad news to me yet, but I'm sure when he does, he'll be utterly charming about it. He'll say, it's not been a great one. It's not been a great one, James. You're down to 0. I said, pardon? 0. You've got 0 listeners. I said, how the hell did that happen? He said, well, we're not entirely sure, but we think it might have something to do with your constant plugging of your own book. So yeah, I was beginning to think I might have gone over the top a bit on that. So if I presided over an audience decline from not far shy of 1.5 million to 0, then what would you expect me to be doing a year later? Pretending nothing had happened? Popping up for interviews as if I'm some sort of sage on matters economic? How bad would you have to be at your job to think that the time has come for a period of silence and reflection? Because however bad you'd have to be, Kwasi Kwarteng was worse. And yet he said one thing during his interview with Nick earlier today, with which I find myself in utter agreement. And that is this. He has no idea what game Suella Braverman is playing. So the polling on sacking her was staggering. It's one of the most popular things. I'm just going to tell you something that's true, all right? This isn't an opinion, it's counting. Sacking Suella Braverman is one of the most popular things that Rishi Sunak has done as Prime Minister. It achieved, in a poll published yesterday, a 70% approval rate. 70% of people think Mr. Sunak made the right decision in removing Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. 60% of people who voted Conservative in 2019 thought that he'd made the right. So arguably the single most popular thing Rishi Sunak has done as Prime Minister was sacking Suella Braverman, which if you got up really early in the morning, you could use to claim that giving her the job in the first place was actually a stroke of genius, because when he fires her a year later, suddenly he does the most popular thing he's done during his entire premiership. You remember, I keep telling you, look at the 15 to 20% that would be comfortable with a fascist dictatorship, the 15 to 20%, the UKIP contingent, the 15 to 20% who just can't really see beyond their hatred of foreigners foreigners, or actually their hatred of themselves being projected onto foreigners, they're never going to move, because guess what percentage of people said that removing Suella Braverman was the wrong decision? You got it, 17%, almost exactly the midpoint in the 15 to 20% that are driven entirely by biliousness and hate. Which brings us to the Daily Mail, of course. They quite like her. They quite like Suella Braverman. The Daily Telegraph are supportive today, giving her very warm write-ups. But the public are repelled by her. The public are repelled by her. And then we turn to the net satisfaction ratings for the Cabinet, which is a very interesting key to how the deluded Conservative Party membership are responding to the latest nonsenses being served up to them by people like Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman. And she's fifth there. She's not even in the top five. Johnny Mercer and Penny Mordaunt are well ahead of her in the net satisfaction ratings for the Cabinet. So, admittedly, this is from November the 6th, so it doesn't include her latest sacking, her second sacking. But it means that all of her talk about Rwanda, all of her talk about dreams, all of her talk about hate marches, all of her refusals to respect the wishes of a Holocaust survivor and moderate the language she deploys to talk about refugees, all of her very commoditized hatred, her very deliberate attempts to stoke up the worst corners of our society are not really working. Actually, maybe that's unfair to the Conservative Party membership. So she's fifth. She's only 3 ahead of Tom Tugendhat. James Cleverly is top. That's very interesting, because I said to you about 6 months to a year ago, well, actually I probably said it both 6 months and a year ago, Cleverly's playing a blinder by doing absolutely nothing, keeping his head down, not getting involved in anything. I hesitate to say this because every time I say anything even vaguely warm about a senior Tory, they pop up the very next day and do something disgusting. But James Cleverly at least seems human. He seems human. I have met him and I liked him. We then fell out on Twitter, but that kind of doesn't count for anything. I met him and I liked him, and when I read yesterday that he delivered a speech at the Foreign Office that included the phrases, "I will not throw anybody under a bus. I will praise in public and I will criticise in private." I just found myself thinking, my God, they need to hear that in the Foreign Office, don't they? Having been used as tools and kindling almost by this dreadful Braverman woman. The full speech that Cleverly gave, I retweeted it yesterday, most of it. It just sounded like a grown-up had entered the building. But I stopped now offering up warm words for James Cleverly, because as a patriot, I want a Foreign Secretary who's good at the job, and my praise for Tories generally seems to preempt the revelation that they're absolutely bloody awful. It's called the Hancock Principle, I think. 16 minutes after 10. So she's not winning over Tory members. She's completely alienating the country, but she's doubling down and tripling down. Her letter, her post-sacking letter, which isn't really a tradition, her post-sacking letter was an exercise in petulant whining and also of truth denial. Claims about things that were either mandated by Brexit or in the 2019 referendum are categorically untrue. Categorically untrue. So, as I break the news to you that the UK government has lost the Supreme Court Rwanda ruling, I'll say that again, Suella Braverman's dreams have been dashed, and the UK government has, as was widely expected, lost the Supreme Court Rwanda ruling. We find ourselves wondering what Suella Braverman's game is. It's 17 minutes after 10. We will respond both to that judgment and that question. Oh, I need to give you the phone number, don't I? If I don't give you the phone number, you know what happens. Same 3 people ring up every day and we never get to hear any new voices or interesting insights. 0345 6060 973. What's Braverman's game, given that the arithmetic suggests that she's alienating way more people than she's appealing to? And what do we think about her dreams of deporting genuine refugees to a country where refugees get shot, being so comprehensively dashed by the Supreme Court? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And to be honest, a bit of immediate reaction to the Supreme Court ruling would almost make this sound like a proper grown-up radio show.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
So 21 minutes after 10 is the time. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government's plan to send asylum seekers and refugees to Rwanda and leave them there, regardless of whether their application was successful or not, has been rejected by the Supreme Court. The reason why it's been rejected, because again, I think this is something that people don't understand, and I don't think it's your fault if you don't understand it. I think that a lot of the people reporting on this don't understand it. We know for a fact that senior Conservative politicians supporting this so-called policy didn't understand it. The simple fact of the matter is Rwanda is not safe, and therefore this policy is not legal. So if the plan was to deport people to France, and France agreed, that's quite crucial, there wouldn't be a problem. I can't foresee the Supreme Court or the Appeal Court or any of the courts that have ruled this unlawful having any problem at all with that proposal. If the third country was a safe country, then there wouldn't be a problem. But the finding is that it's not a safe country. And if you want to live in a country where Suella Braverman, who dreams of deporting people to a place where refugees get shot dead by police, gets to decide whether it's safe or not, then I think you've got to give your head a bit of a wobble. These decisions are reached by independent judiciaries, and the decision is it is not safe. Do you want to hear 2 minutes of the ruling from the Supreme Court just a few moments ago? Well, whether you do or not, you're about to.
As I've explained, the legal test which has to be applied in this case is whether there are substantial grounds for believing that asylum seekers sent to Rwanda would be at real risk of refoulement. In the light of the evidence which I have summarised, the Court of Appeal concluded that there were such grounds. We are unanimously of the view that they were entitled to reach that conclusion. Indeed, having been taken through the evidence ourselves, we agree with their conclusion. We accept the Home Secretary's submission that the Rwandan government entered into the agreement in good faith, and that the capacity of the Rwandan system to produce accurate and fair decisions can and will be built up. Nevertheless, asking ourselves whether there were substantial grounds for believing that a real risk of refoulement existed at the relevant time, we have concluded that there were. The changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed. There is also a cross-appeal on behalf of one of the asylum claimants who argues that the Rwandan policy is in breach of retained EU law, as well as being unlawful for the reasons that I've already explained. We reject that argument on the basis that under an Act of Parliament enacted in 2020, the EU provisions in question ceased to have effect at the end of that year. The cross-appeal is therefore also dismissed.
24 minutes after 10 is the time. The key decision there, the upholding of the appeal and the decision that the government's plan to deport people to Rwanda is unlawful because Rwanda is unsafe. The President of the Supreme Court, Lord Reed, delivering that widely expected verdict, although, of course, not by any stretch of the imagination guaranteed. I think that we will park Suella Braverman for a moment, if we can. Just focus on your reactions to that ruling. Because at risk of sounding a little bit aloof, if you genuinely understand what was at stake here, I don't understand how you can have wanted it to go through, unless you're prepared to say, I really want refugees to be sent to an unsafe country. It's bizarre. It's just bizarre what's happened to our country in the last few years. Even if you think we take too many refugees, even if I let you hold on to that opinion, despite the fact that it doesn't really stand up to international comparisons or scrutiny, even if you think there are just too many people here and therefore the best people to get rid of are recent arrivals and foreigners, even if you think any of those things, it shouldn't lead you to where Suella Braverman goes. It shouldn't lead you to the belief that refugees should be sent to a country where refugees get shot. It just shouldn't. But I'm always open to persuasion, and I will open up the phone lines now on the simple question of what do you think of this? What does it do to the broader question of politics? What does it do to Rishi Sunak? We know it's dashed Suella Braverman's dreams. And if you want to get emotional and tell me why there's a tear in your eye today, then feel free to do that as well. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Because I'll tell you now, nobody's got the answers to these questions yet. What can the government do? What will the government do? The government don't know. Make noises, read the room, change the law. We shall see. But what are your immediate reactions to this news? Because from where I'm sitting, I mean, it's terrible that we've had to come to this, but it's about the best news we've had in the context of persecuting foreigners since 2016. 27 after 10 is the time. Natasha Clark is LBC's political editor, and she is at the Supreme Court. What happens now?
This is going to be really hard, I think, James, for him, the Prime Minister that is, to get out of. I don't quite see the way ahead. That judgment that was just handed down to us just now was incredibly damning, and also crucially it was agreed by all 5 of the Supreme Court justices. Now, last time at the Court of Appeal we had a split judgment where there was one judge who disagreed with the other 2 on the application of this point of law. But not today. All 5 of them unanimously agreed that there is a chance that anybody that is sent to Rwanda as part of the Home Secretary's migration policy could be then sent back to their home nation where they could be at risk of ill treatment. And that is the foundation of this judgment today, the point of law that was being looked at. They essentially agreed. Lord Justice Reid, reading out the decision today, said he agreed with the Court of Appeal and all of the points in it. I don't quite see how Rishi Sunak has any wiggle room today to get out of that. He is going to be scratching his head now looking at how to respond to this, and we should be getting a statement at some point this morning from the government on what their next steps might be. I was speaking to some people yesterday who suggested that if they lose today, there could be a possibility of doing a legally binding treaty with Rwanda to try and get around some of those legal pitfalls they referred to them as. But I don't quite see how that would work in light of this judgment today, because all of these judges agree that there is still that risk of people being sent from Rwanda to an unsafe third country. And I don't think that a treaty with Rwanda would allay any of those concerns.
So any hope of wiggle room, which under most analyses was Rishi Sunak's best chance here, has been summarily removed by the judges.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, reading that judgment that's just come out, the final section, they've dismissed basically everything that the Home Secretary put to them to appeal it. The only thing that they did accept was that the Home Secretary in Rwanda did agree and enter the agreement in good faith. But yes, just listening to him just now, they said that there was a risk that the court system would be biased if there were any appeals in Rwanda for hearing these people's cases for why they should be allowed to stay and not be sent to another country or back home. And they also made the point that even the UK government themselves have made several complaints about the treatment of not just the Rwandan government but the police, including threats to kill people here in Britain as well. So it's painting a very damning picture of Rwanda as a country that obviously judges here feel it is not a safe country to send refugees and asylum seekers to. Like I say, I just do not see how the government can make a case that Rwanda is a safe country to do so, because all these 5 judges are unanimous in that decision.
487 asylum decisions in 2021 in total for the whole of Rwanda, just shy of 140,000 cases in the UK asylum backlog. So it's an utterly irrelevant policy in numerical terms or statistical terms. Why has it assumed such epic significance politically?
It was obviously a huge gamble for the Prime Minister of the time, Boris Johnson, and for the Home Secretary of the time, Priti Patel, to even engage in the idea of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Their country is just not equipped to deal with this, like you say, just in terms of the sheer numbers.
I saw pictures of Suella Braverman cackling outside what she claimed were the facilities in which the refugees would be housed.
Yeah, and I went to see them as well. I went to visit Hope House Hostel in Rwanda. They took us round. They showed us where the refugees would be staying. I'm not going to lie to you, it seemed like perfectly fine accommodation to stay in, but that's not the point. The point is that Rwanda, as a country, cannot deal with the infrastructure, and that's what the courts have said today, with taking in all of the numbers of asylum seekers that we could possibly send from the UK over to Rwanda. And the judge today said the changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in future, yes, but they have not shown to be in place now. This Rwanda policy now appears to me just to be dead in the water.
Thank you, Natasha Clark. And the scale, the strength of the judgment, the unanimity of the judgment being particularly pertinent to Natasha's conclusions about the future of this policy. I'm interested in its past as well. I mean, again, we could play the coma game. If you've been asleep for 5 years, you woke up today and the entire British media and political establishment is focused upon the Supreme Court rejection of a policy that would have barely nibbled at the edges of our asylum backlog. You'd sort of wonder what the hell was going on. But Natasha just told us, obliquely, unwittingly, between the lines of what Natasha said, this dates back to Boris Johnson's premiership, where everything was about announcing stuff that would just get you through the next news cycle. Suella Braverman perhaps too stupid to realise, and Priti Patel too craven. But Boris Johnson, they're very cross about the old immigration, the old refugees, people in boats. Well, let's just say we're going to deport them all to Rwanda. It's never going to happen, but, we'll have moved on to something else by this time tomorrow. That's what always happened with Boris Johnson. I got sick to death of explaining it to you. Whenever they said anything publicly, if it was coming from Johnson, then it was designed solely and exclusively to protect his backside or to promote his desire for constant self-gratification. So that's what it did. But, of course, by the time the newspapers have got behind it and half-witted politicians like Suella Braverman, it looks like a proper policy proposal. 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. Your thoughts on this enormous setback for Rishi Sunak after the very latest headlines with Holly Harris.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:37 is the time. We do enter little periods, don't we, of politics where I could almost say to you every day, what's actually going on? How did it come to this? What is occurring? Because this Rwanda Supreme Court decision, which was, by the way, widely expected, it's cost us an absolute fortune. They've spent £1.5 million defending it in court alone up to this point. I think the estimate of how much has been spent on it, how much has been given to Rwanda, is 140 million. And the simple question of whether or not Rwanda is safe, you could have answered in 10 minutes simply by talking to people like my guest yesterday, Karine Kanimba, whose father was kidnapped and tortured by Paul Kagame's regime just a couple of years ago, or speaking to the families of the 12 refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo who were shot dead by police in 2018. And they're not even criteria that the judgment today has accommodated. They're looking solely at whether or not Rwanda's asylum application system is safe. And it isn't, because there is absolutely no guarantee that the Rwandan authorities wouldn't send someone back to the Democratic Republic of Congo or send someone back to a scene of unfolding genocide or famine or war. So how they ended up backing it so much is something I'm not sure many people can answer. I will just refer back to something else Natasha said about having gone on that trip. She did so in her previous guise as a political correspondent on The Sun. And the only people invited on that trip were from The Sun, The Times, The Daily Mail, The Daily Express, The Daily Telegraph and GBB's. The Press Association went because they have to, and BBC Africa was there because, again, it would be absolutely unprecedented for Suella Braverman to refuse access to BBC Africa. But that means that the trips were paid for friendly organs. The Sun, Rupert Murdoch's Times, The Daily Mail, The Daily Express, The Daily Telegraph and GBB's, which has fewer viewers than you have fingers. And that is how we got here. The reporting of it has been designed to make you think it was either fair or plausible, when clearly, as the Supreme Court has found, it was neither. But hey ho, what's 140 million quid between friends, or 1.5 million in legal fees? Barbara's in haven't. What would you like to say, Barbara? Have at them. Have at them, Barbara.
I just phoned up to share my undiluted and utter joy at the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court. I am so happy. We were going into a very dark moment, and I'm very glad that the court has stopped the country going down a very dark and uncivilized route where we no longer think of refugees as people who deserve our compassion, but as somehow a threat to countries. It was just such a dark.
How did we come
horrible.
to this? How did we come to this, Barbara?
Oh gosh, how did we come to enacting a policy such as the one we've enacted?
Well, then, it could have gone the other way, technically. Almost everybody I spoke to who had an opinion was of the view that it would go this way. There was some dispute about whether it would be quite as sweeping and unanimous as it is. But nobody really thought the government, including the government. I mean, even right-wing newspapers are saying ministers are expecting to be defeated.
Yes.
So they've bet their house on an almost certain loss, and you have to wonder why.
You do have to wonder why. Well, Colin Yeo on Nick Ferrari's show made an interesting point.
He was brilliant, wasn't he? I heard that, actually.
He always is.
Yes.
And he really knows his stuff.
They won't be booking him again.
No. That perhaps there was a constitutional issue as to whether the courts were allowed to pronounce on legislation passed by Parliament. But I think that this was such a blatant case of Rwanda, the country that you declare to be a safe country, to which it is okay to send asylum seekers, is not a safe country. There is so much evidence, all sorts of human rights indices. I can't quote them now. I had written them down. Of course, I can't find the page.
Not good enough. Not good enough. You're in detention.
I've given them very low scores for transparency, for political freedom, etc., etc. Everybody knows, despite many efforts that the country might have made since the disaster of the dreadful massacres all those years ago. No, the country is not a safe country. And how does a civilized country think that it's a good idea to send already traumatized people to somewhere where they are likely to meet with further trauma, further hardship?
At the very least, uncertainty and
well, that is trauma, isn't it? I mean, if
then sorry, Barbara, I leant on the wrong button there. Carry on.
People who have been waiting in limbo, who have left their countries, lots of them fleeing all sorts of situations that we can't even imagine, coming to another country, hoping to find some certainty, some security, things that we all want and need and are entitled to, and then to say, no, well, actually, we're going to ship you off somewhere
unsafe. You've understandably swerved the question, which I won't ask you because I think it will probably elude all of us to answer this one. Is the dreaming bit? Can we get that clip just to remind ourselves how grim it is? Can we get the clip of Suella Braverman talking about dreaming about deporting people who we have subsequently discovered, because when she said that, most of us probably weren't paying attention, could and would include people who have been through the hellish situations that Barbara describes. Listen, if it means a lot to you, I will say now, there may be some lead swingers also caught up in this net. There may be some people who would turn out not to be bona fide asylum seekers. They would be economic migrants or whatever you prefer to call them. But that's not the point, is it? The point is that there would be people fleeing utter horrors. And Suella Braverman dreamt of deporting them to Rwanda, an objectively unsafe country. It is an extraordinary moment in British history, this. The more you think about it, the more baffled and disgusted you become. Unless, of course, you're part of Suella's army, Braverman's boys, the knuckle-dragging hooligans who sought to desecrate the cenotaph, no less, on Saturday in order to demonstrate how patriotic they are. I'll come to Lorraine in Whitehaven first after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:47 is the time. It is easy to get depressed, isn't it? You know, we've got an Enoch Powell tribute act popping up on a game show now in the Australian rainforest, and until yesterday, this woman was Home Secretary. Her second crack of the whip after being fired for an egregious security breach about which I think she lied. during her first tenure in the job. But this surely must be a moment that, if we return to a space of equilibrium as a population, if we return to a semblance of normality, and I don't mean, necessarily a Labour government, I mean a Conservative government led by John Major, perhaps, or even the early years of David Cameron, before the full horrors and cynicism of austerity became crystal clear to everybody, honest. If we ever return to that sort of normality, I wonder how this little episode, the fact that this came from the mouth not of a far-right fringe figure, but in fact a far-right Home Secretary.
Why can't you stop the small boats coming?
It's a deeply entrenched and complex problem. That's a simple answer. And I would love to be here saying, claiming victory. I would love to be having a front page of the Telegraph with a plane taking off to Rwanda. That's my dream. It's
when
my
will
obsession.
That happen?
It's my dream, it's my obsession, to deport completely blameless and innocent people to an unsafe country where refugees have been recently shot and the regime continues to kidnap, imprison and torture its critics. I mean, I know I bang on a bit, but I cannot for the life of me put together all of the pieces of the jigsaw to explain how this happened. 10:49 is the time. What do you make of it all? Lorraine is in Whitehaven. Lorraine, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my call and for giving me an opportunity to express, really, my relief.
Yes.
My initial feeling was absolute total relief that for once we have what seems to be a voice that is really speaking for the majority of the British people, because so many times we're told this is what the British people want, and that's what the Conservatives seem to trot out all the time. And here we have the highest legal voice in the land, a group of 5 eminent people who've looked at the legalities, the law and the rights, and have come to a conclusion. I listened to the whole conclusion. We're retired and very try to keep ourselves informed as we can about politics. And so we did listen, and the delivery and the clarity with which this ruling was delivered,
yes,
I don't see how it can be challenged by anyone. In particularly, what was interesting was he was at pains to say that this is not just based on the European Convention of Human Rights. There is a passage in his delivery where he listed all the other conventions that Britain is a part of.
Yes.
And he was very clear that in the application of all of those, the decision is clear. It wasn't a political decision. He was at pains to express that, which I thought was wonderful, because it isn't a political decision. It's a moral decision. And I thought that today...
This is paragraph 26 of the ruling, and it's the principle of non-refoulement, which I've almost certainly pronounced incorrectly, Lorraine, and it therefore given effect not only by the European Convention on Human Rights, but also by other international conventions to which the United Kingdom is party. It is a core principle of international law to which the United Kingdom government has repeatedly committed itself on the international stage,
Exactly.
consistently with this country's reputation for developing and upholding the rule of law. The dog like that.
The dog loved it, James. The dog loved it. We have a Labour voting dog in our house. So I think that the judge was absolutely giving a steer that this ruling has been informed by many, many sources,
Yes.
and not just the European Convention on Human Rights yet. So I was ecstatic. I was delighted, because I thought for once, maybe in light of what's happened this week with Suella, obviously the Rwandan government have played a blinder. They've conned us out of
140 million
billions.
pounds. Well, I don't know, actually. To be fair, if we're going to cite the ruling, then it did make it clear that it was actually signed in good faith. So I think Rwanda were probably expecting to receive. They probably wouldn't adjudge themselves to be an unsafe destination, so they would have been expecting to receive at least a few asylum seekers, at least a few refugees, but it hasn't happened. Would you like to play a little game with me, Lorraine?
Go on then.
So which Conservative, do you remember that disgusting Daily Mail front page that was deeply, deeply reminiscent of Nazi propaganda when Paul Dacre described judges as enemies of the people?
I do.
That was one of the lowest moments in modern history, modern media history, modern political history, modern history, full stop. Which Conservative MP do you think has already resurrected that disgusting Nazi reminiscent headline? Is it A, 30p Lennox Anderson? Is it B, Dame Andrea Jenkins? Or is it C, Brendan Clark Smith, the MP for Bassetlaw?
Well, I would say it's potentially all of the above, but
Yes.
my money would be on 30p Lee.
Oh dear, I'm afraid that no cigar for you today,
No.
Lorraine. No, I'm throwing your ticket back into the tombola. Thank you very much for your call. David is in Sheffield. David, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, thanks, James. Spoke to you last time about Nadine Dorries, actually, but I work in the law, and the
Are you a burglar?
Could be. This judgment is actually as strong as it gets from an appeal court.
Tell me more.
Because the remit of an appeal court is to decide whether the court below it from which the appeal came was entitled to reach their decision. The Supreme Court has said here, not only were they entitled to reach that decision, which would have been good enough to dismiss the appeal, they have said the 5 most senior justices in the country have also agreed with the majority decision of the lower court. And that's relatively unusual. They didn't need to go that far to say that. So what they've done is effectively iron out any wiggle room.
Yes.
So you've got, if you took the majority from the previous court, you would add 5 to it.
Yes.
And it would be either 8-1 or 7-1, rather than the majority in the lower court. So a real kick-in, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I think Sunak has realised that already. You'd be surprised if he hadn't. Which I'll read you his comments in the last few minutes. We have seen today's judgment and will now consider next steps. This was not the outcome we wanted, but we have spent the last few months planning for all eventualities, and we remain completely committed to stopping the boats. Crucially, the Supreme Court, like the Court of Appeal and the High Court before it, has confirmed that the principle of sending illegal migrants to a safe third country for processing is lawful. This confirms the government's clear view from the outset. So again, choosing the language of tabloid red meat with illegal migrants rather than refugees or asylum seekers. But, he continues, illegal migration destroys lives and costs British taxpayers millions of pounds a year, 140 million so far to Rwanda alone. We need to end it, and we will do whatever it takes to do so, because when people know that if they come here illegally, they won't get to stay, then they will stop coming altogether. And we will stop the boats. The Home Secretary... Hang on a minute, I'm doing the grown-up stuff, David. God's sake, it doesn't happen very often. At least that's quite all right. The Home Secretary is expected to make a statement in the House this afternoon, and there'll be a press conference at Downing Street at approximately 4:45 this afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, there's a grown-up solution to this, isn't there? The real problem exists because of the lack of safe places to seek asylum. In terms of or
safe routes to this country, because we don't do anything like as much as some other countries do, or indeed as we have done in the. So they created this problem by closing down safe routes, and then they failed to solve it. But they still go on.
So it's almost as if they've waited for people to make the mistake they accused them of, to then deport them to Rwanda. If there was a place in a third country where people could actually apply for asylum, and it was cleared or declined then, we would do away with an awful lot of these problems, because they wouldn't come here in the first place.
Yeah, well, that is also true, although an altogether more long-term approach to the perceived problems. The unavoidable truth of this is, and as David has alluded to, the scale of the judgment, the swinging nature of the government is disastrous for the Tory party, because years of trying to distract the public from their own failures with xenophobic rhetoric have now run into a brick wall. Even Sunak seems to understand it. He's not talking about taking other measures. He's simply celebrating the fact of something we already knew, which is if you can find a safe third country to which you can outsource these applications, then there's nothing to stop you doing so legally. But if it was a safe third country, an awful lot of the people who've got a massive problem with the Rwanda proposal would have at least some of their concerns assuaged. So it's even now deeply disingenuous. But the conversation's over. They've got nothing now to cling to except this ludicrous rhetoric that they are the ones to solve a problem entirely of their own creation. It's a very, very, very strange state of affairs. David, thank you. The phone lines are open. I think this is a big enough story for us to stay with. We'll certainly take a little bit more expert contribution as well. Adam Wagner, who's helped us out many times, a human rights lawyer, points out that the letter from Suella Braverman herself, in many ways, and she was too stupid herself to realise this. But this, of course, is a woman whose CV as a barrister contained a boast that she'd helped work on a legal textbook. And then the author of the legal textbook, it was brought to his attention by the Big Issue magazine, and he responded that she didn't help at all. I asked her to do some photocopying once, and that was it. So that's the mind that you're dealing with here. You're dealing with someone who's already become a barrister, much to the surprise, I'm told, of many of her law school cohort. When she got what's called a pupillage, they couldn't quite believe it, but secure a pupillage she did, possibly by deploying similar tactics to the ones she then put on her job description, on her CV, on her chamber's website, where she claimed to have been a contributor to a legal textbook written by a man who subsequently described her contribution as helping with some photocopying once. So that's the mind you're dealing with here. Therefore, it's perfectly possible she didn't realise just how much she was giving away by accident during her post-sacking letter yesterday. Pick over the detail of what she gave away and you realise just how rancid this whole episode has been. I'll explain after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
So we will get more expert analysis of this. It is one of the mornings where I'm very conscious of my lack of qualification for going in deep. But we can certainly go in hard. How did this happen? How did we become a country where a ludicrous and deeply immoral policy became a hook upon which Rishi Sunak's government, you remember, Mr. Professionalism, Accountability and Integrity, hung so much of their credibility when, as the dust settles on this Rwanda ruling, it is pretty hard to escape the conclusion that it would have been a miracle if it had gone the other way. What is surprising is just how far it has gone in the direction of rejection. No wriggle room whatsoever. And crucially, a complete clarity from these judges that the European Convention on Human Rights, even if we weren't in it, even if we were to dance on Winston Churchill's grave, even if we were to abandon one of his most precious legacies, even if we were to pull out somehow of the European Convention on Human Rights, this policy would still have been illegal. And remember that Suella Braverman was supposed to be a lawyer. She was an attorney general under Johnson, I think. The idea that she would be so ignorant of the law or so contemptuous of the law is almost unbelievable. But when you see one Tory knuckle-dragger already resurrecting that disgusting Nazi-themed Daily Mail front page, Enemies of the People, then you realise that contempt for independent judges, a crucial constituent of fascism throughout the ages, well, they're now saying it. They're saying the quiet part out loud. It is extraordinary. The time is 4 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to try and find some comments from Idiot's Corner because it's important, I think, to reflect what is going on out there. You may hear these people on other shows. They sadly tend not to ring me anymore. Here's John. Bad news about Rwanda. And goodness me, mate, how you've managed to spell it like that. It's almost as if you've swallowed a Scrabble board and then vomited the letters back up again. Do you really think that the illegals, immigrants that are pouring in, with no you, would really go to a third country to apply? You know as well as I do they won't. The genuine refugees might, but not that many of them. If they were genuine, they would have stayed in the first safe country they came to. I mean, John, I almost have to admire the levels of ignorance you need to sustain that position after all of the explanation and evidence that has been provided, not least on this programme, about why that's completely stupid. Let me try and make it incredibly simple for you. And I would do it in words of one syllable, but Ukraine has 2 syllables in it, and so does Poland. So I'm not going to be able to confine myself entirely to words of one syllable. If you are forced to stay in the first safe land, every single refugee coming out of Ukraine would have been stuck in Poland, pal. Just use your noodle, will you, before you waste 10p texting me. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. Lizzie Durden is a Home Affairs specialist, a superb journalist, currently plying her trade as a freelance and probably one of the closest observers of both the broader picture and the specifics of this morning's judgment. Lizzie, what for you are the key surprises, if that's the right word to use?
Morning. I think the key surprises are really how far this ruling has gone beyond the Rwanda case itself. It was the Rwanda deal specifically that the court was deciding on, but the principles at the case have actually made it much more difficult for the government to do any similar deals in future, because what the court said is effectively any Home Secretary does not have the power to decide that such a scheme is safe just on the basis of what another country has promised them. So in this case, there are many, many issues with Rwanda: torture, political assassinations, human rights abuses, lack of a functioning asylum system, Afghans and Syrians being sent back to their home countries. The Home Office's position, I would say Home Secretary, but obviously we've had many. Yes. The Home Office's position was that didn't matter because Rwanda had promised the UK that under this agreement, that wouldn't happen and people would be processed lawfully and safely. What the Supreme Court said is that the government did not have the power to make that call on promises alone. And because it's the Supreme Court, that principle will now apply to any future deal the government tries to do.
So you can't just take the word of a country that is abusing refugees that they won't abuse these ones in layman's terms and in a nutshell.
Exactly that. And the court drew quite a strong constitutional line there. They rejected one of the arguments that had been made on behalf of the Home Secretary, which likened the case to national security. And where there are national security decisions, it's convention for courts to give a high degree of what they call regard to political decisions on the basis that the government and security services are privy to information that the judges are not. But in this case, they said, no, this is an issue based on facts and evidence, and on the facts and evidence, this is not safe, and the Home Secretary can't decide otherwise just because Rwanda said so.
Facts and evidence, eh? They had to come back round eventually, didn't they? And the role of the European Convention on Human Rights in this, and that perhaps, again, a slightly surprising conclusion that even if we had somehow extricated ourselves from it, this ruling would have stayed more or less the same.
Yes, exactly. So what this ruling came down to was the issue of safety in Rwanda, and specifically the issue about whether refugees sent there could ultimately end up in the countries they originally fled. That principle is called non-refoulement. The people who appealed against the Rwanda deal used the European Convention on Human Rights to kind of bring into effect that principle that they couldn't be sent back to unsafe countries. But what the Supreme Court said is that principle isn't just contained in the European Convention of Human Rights, it's also contained in multiple international treaties, multiple UK laws that were passed as far back as 1993 by a Conservative government. Yeah. And so merely withdrawing from the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which some Conservative MPs, including Suella Braverman, have advocated for, that would not solve this issue, and that would not make the Rwanda deal or anything like it legal.
Is this paragraph 52 are you referring to?
I haven't got the ruling in front of me at this moment. Don't worry,
because no, that's fine. One of my listeners, Jason, is very active in this field, very, very enthusiastic. He suggests that there is, there appears to be an oblique suggestion, an implication that government officials would have been well placed to determine whether Rwanda was actually safe or not, but that ministers might not have listened to them. Yes,
that happened as well. What they did point out, during the course of this case, we've had a lot of evidence on how Rwanda was actually selected. And what the court heard going right back to the first stage was that actually officials in the Foreign Office had advised against Rwanda even being considered. In 2020, when the government first went to the Foreign Office and said, look, we're considering doing this kind of deal, can you draw us up a list of countries that could be suitable? The Foreign Office said not Rwanda, and it was added back into consideration when they said particular interest was shown by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel.
There it is. The particular interest was shown by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, despite the fact that everybody qualified in the relevant departments was telling them that Rwanda could not and would not be a suitable destination for these human beings. I mean, it is actually remarkable because they pressed on with it, and we may wonder a little about why they pressed on with it in the face of such overwhelming objection. What happens now, finally, Lizzie? What happens now?
Well, there's no further route of appeal for the government. We have just very recently had a statement from the new Home Secretary, James Cleverly, and there's no sign in that brief statement of the government attempting to contest this case any further. And actually, the statement made a mention of the Rwanda scheme being only one part of the government's wider plan to reduce small boat crossings. So it will be interesting to see whether the government continues pursuing this model of deal, this idea that if it can somehow send refugees abroad, they'll be deterred, or actually if this is the start of a pivot to potentially more realistic aims they might hope does the same thing.
You mean things with a prospect of success? Is it? I mean, I know you don't like veering into the realms of speculation, but it occurs to me that the safer a country is, the more likely it is to be dealing with its own applications already.
Yeah, there is a bit of a kind of Venn diagram here where countries that have kind of functioning asylum systems and are used to taking refugees are probably quite busy anyway. You know, most of the countries in Europe, for example, with the waves of migration we've seen from countries of conflict in the Middle East and Africa. So I think we haven't ever had the list of countries that were considered, but it was strongly suggested that very many of them were potentially other countries in parts of Africa where they didn't already have functioning asylum systems comparable to ours in place, and that's why it will be such a problem for the government if it tries to strike a deal like this again.
Lizzie Dearden, many thanks indeed. You can follow Lizzie on, in all the usual places. I do so most on Twitter, and always find her to be an expert at cutting through some of the noise, some of the grey areas, and coming straight to the clarity, as indeed she did there. Let's talk to Angus in Cirencester. The poor chap's been hanging on for ages. Angus, what made you pick up the phone?
I picked it up, James, and my apologies. I didn't listen to your show to begin with.
What?
Because I wanted to listen to what the judgment
on
was.
This occasion, I'll allow that on this occasion, but please don't make a habit of it, Angus.
It wasn't unexpected. In fact, the judgment was as expected. But what stirred me up and got me really angry with the government was the fact it was unanimous. They went through point after point of law. Also, as has been mentioned by others since I listened, facts that this was clearly an unsafe country. Yes. And I wonder why. I mean, as I said, if I went to court and spent an enormous amount of money because my lawyers advised me, I'd be furious with the lawyers. What's going on here?
Point, yes.
The government has spent tens and tens of millions, well over 100 million, maybe 150 million of our money just to pursue a political, I don't know, strategy, I guess.
Well, it gets a bit Brexity at this point, because I found myself then framing in my mind the sentence, despite all of the experts telling them it wouldn't work. Exactly. You know, blind Freddie. I mean, honestly, as the Supreme Court judge went through point after point after point, I was saying to myself, how on earth could the government have ever imagined that this was going to be allowed and to be legal? And so they've spun it out. And of course, I expect them to spin it out further. You've mentioned already that Tory MPs are saying, you know, these judges again and the enemies of the people and so forth and so on. Rishi Sunak's claim of integrity and all the rest of it is just absolutely. It just gets more and more ridiculous.
Of the water by today's decision.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether, having fired Suella Braverman already, he's sort of thinking maybe I should have waited until this and then fired her, and claimed that I trusted her. You know, she's a lawyer. I'm not. I'm a money man. I'm a numbers man. She's the lawyer. She told me this was all golden. Oh, what an absolute... I don't know, though, because he's apparently quite a control freak. I was reading somewhere that even when he gets into a car, he tells the driver what route to take. He thinks he can do everybody's job better than they do. But it might perhaps have given him a little bit more wiggle room to be able to pin this all entirely on her. And what does she do now? Her dreams haven't just been dashed. They've been run through a mangle, cut into a million different pieces and set fire to. And the more we talk about it today, the more it becomes clear that this was almost inevitable. The only thing that was in doubt, perhaps, was the extremity of the judgment, and it could not be more extreme, or indeed worse news for this government. And the other thing, thank you, Angus, very briefly before we go to the next junction. This is what happens with populism. Populism is like trying to feed a bottomless pit. You think, I've just throw something more into it, then we'll be okay. But when the people in charge become populists, it's all right when the people on the sidelines are populists. You know, most obviously in the context of racist policies, it would be Nigel Farage. But when it's actual policy makers that go in for populism, that's when the wheels come off. Or when you have to ramp it up to the reality denial status of proper fascism. Because you can't ever sate populism. The appetite, once the appetite is piqued, populism becomes insatiable. So what happens now is somebody who never has the responsibility for delivering policy, for example, Brendan Clark-Smith, can poo-poo the judgment and claim that things could have gone differently, or try to blame it on the judges, which was, again, very popular with Nazis. Try and blame it all on the judges, because you're really blaming it on the law and the clever people who understand it. But if you're a thick person who doesn't, like Brendan Clark-Smith, then the temptation to blame it all on the judges becomes irresistible. And the populism moves into a new gear, because the populism becomes, like Brexit, this could work if only people believed more, or this could work if only if it wasn't for you pesky experts, or this could work if only if it wasn't for you pesky judges. So the sidelines now become populated by people claiming that this could have somehow worked in an alternative universe. And that is the door that Brexit opened. The idea of alternative universes, where alternative facts are as applicable as actual facts, and where truth is negotiable, and where facts are less important than feelings. And that, of course, wasn't Brexit exclusively, but it was Brexit times Boris Johnson equals all of this. It's 11:18.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
Idiot's Corner, anybody? Here's a good one. No, James. Brexit opened the door to parliamentary sovereignty, allowing the United Kingdom to rule and decide without the European Union. Oh, mate, seriously, if you're still clinging to those canards, then I've got a Rwanda policy I'd like to sell you. Claude's in Richmond. Claude, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning, James. So what made me pick up the phone is I am really glad that the outcome has said that this Rwanda plan is unlawful. We've been in massive problems for some time with the justice system, and also of how the justice system has got this populism angle. So I'm glad that the Supreme Court have found that it's unlawful. However, what the problem that we do have, and we have to look at, is the reason why we need a ceasefire, for example.
Well,
We've had so many...
I don't want to sound ungrateful, but I've got quite enough on my plate with the topic that I've chosen to talk about this morning.
Okay, well, in regard to the topic that we are talking about...
Ceasefire will be on the agenda tomorrow, almost certainly, after the vote this evening, and Keir Starmer's continuing troubles with the issue. But I think the failure of the Rwanda policy, I thought quite obviously, Claude, is what we're actually talking about today.
Yes, well, basically, what the problem is that we found a government that thinks Rwanda is a safe place to locate. Well,
I don't even think that's true.
Not.
I don't think they ever did think that. They knew it wasn't. They just thought they'd somehow be able to. They'd somehow be able to force it through the courts. Or, and this is the thing that I might open the phone lines to now. Was there a plan B? I hesitate to invite anybody to step into the fevered imagination of Suella Braverman. You'd have to have a good wash afterwards. But would there be a plan B? Because, you know, this Brendan Clark-Smith character, who is in very, very grave danger of making Lee Anderson look intelligent, he's already gone for the front page that the Mail used to attack judges during the post-Brexit chaos, the enemies of the people front page, probably the single most disgusting newspaper front page of my lifetime. with the obvious exception of Kelvin Mackenzie's Hillsborough front page, which is just in a class of disgustingness and horror, all of its own. But in the cycle of normal news, rather than a disgusting man telling disgusting lies in the hope of making his readers... I don't even know. I don't even know how you go down that road with the Hillsborough front page for The Sun. But the enemies of the people front page on the front of the Mail, to be resurrecting that now is extraordinary. But is that plan B? So these angry, thick people who have dominated British politics now for 7 years and have taken over the Conservative Party, they now want to turn their supporters against judges, against laws, against human rights. I mean, we know that they do. But reading this judgment, and the more you read it, the clearer it becomes that they were almost certainly doomed to fail. What was Plan B? Maybe Plan B has been completely scuppered by the unanimity of the ruling. Thank you, Claude. Giles is in Tilburg in the Netherlands. Giles, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome.
You've been a source of sanity as I despair over what's happening in the UK from my exile in the Netherlands.
People often say that to me, Giles, but it has occurred to me latterly that I don't know that you're telling the truth. Perhaps you're as bonkers as the day is long. I don't know that I've helped to maintain your sanity, do I? How are you going to prove
it? I am bonkers, but hopefully in a good way.
Carry on.
What I wanted to say, it's great the Supreme Court has validated decency. And it makes me wish I could do PMQ today, as it's ironic the most forceful critic of the government now is Suella Braverman, or as the chap on LBC in the evening calls her, Suella Doberman.
Who does that, Nick? Abbott?
I can't remember his name. I only listened to the evening show once. But anyway, instead what Sunak's going to get is a rather tepid gumming from an elderly sort of beagle. It's very depressing.
You mean Keir Starmer?
Yeah.
Yes. You're in danger of doing what Claude did and just veering a little bit too far away from the topic that's actually under discussion. So I will politely steer you back into the Rwanda lane, if I may.
You may, obviously.
And also, remember, Starmer's a lawyer. He's a former director of public prosecutions. Today, and I grant you that there are many occasions where he fails to rise to the occasion. But today is one of the days where you'd expect Starmer to be on form, actually. We shall see. We shall reconvene, Giles, afterwards and compare notes.
I mean, it would veer off away from the actual topic of your call-in, because I actually have a precise idea of what I would say. But regarding the Rwanda situation, I think it is going to further highlight how the right of the Tory party has moved further right, as they have been shameless for some time. But Suella is basically going to be campaigning to be leader of the opposition until the election.
But this has done her. I don't think this has done her any good at all. So you're looking at that possibility on Monday that by getting rid of her, he was calling time on the culture war. And then yesterday we thought that appointing Esther McVeigh as the new Gammon Maypole somehow meant that he was keeping the culture wars alive. But the more I thought about that when I came off air yesterday, the more I thought she's such a rubbish Gammon Maypole and she's going to have no input whatsoever into proper policy. She's just going to make announcements about blobs and say, I am here to fight the blob, or the tofu-eating wokarati. She won't be allowed anywhere near cabinet proper or indeed substantive policy making. Maybe he is dialing down the culture war stuff. He's just thrown Esther McVeigh's Gammon Maypole to the sort of gnashing idiots like Clark Smith and Anderson on the backbenches, and then you see today's ruling giving Sunak even more room to go into the next election as the slightly more centrist. He's not a centrist. David Cameron's not a centrist either, but just as not encumbered by the bile and hatred of people like Braverman. So he could at least look back on his defeat and think, well, at least I went into the election being a little bit truer to myself than I was when I pretended to be on the same page as people like Braverman and Anderson. I don't know, Giles. Well, but PMQs is on the way. Thank you for reminding us. Natasha will join us at about 10 to 12, I imagine, and we'll have a look at what's likely to come up, although there are no prizes then for predicting what the main topic of conversation may be. Scott's in Glasgow. Scott, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello, Scott.
Mixed emotions.
Yes.
One, obviously so happy that this ruling has come through, and utterly depressed that where we've got to. I was always wondering what was going to be the straw that broke the camel's back. It would make me finally lift up the phone to you. After
it's
all
always
these
interesting. It's always interesting that.
And I can only hope that Suella Braverman has been as far as we'll go, because if she had a political dream, well, I certainly have a political dream, and my political dream is this cult that's become the Tory party gets absolutely obliterated at the next general election. They talk about speaking for the silent majority. Well, I hope the silent majority are people that, like myself and the people that I speak to, that are absolutely depressed.
Well, it's cobblers as well.
To get to vote.
Yeah, 70% of people thought that Rishi Sunak made the right decision in sacking Braverman, which I think makes it the most popular thing he's ever done. 60% of people who voted Tory in 2019 thought that it was the right decision to sack her, and she's even being beaten by Johnny Mercer and Penny Mordaunt in the net satisfaction ratings among the cult itself, among the Conservative Party membership. So this idea, when they say silent majority, they mean Rupert Murdoch and Paul Dacre, don't they? They don't mean that's it, really. And 15 to 20% of people who'd probably be quietly comfortable with the idea of a fascist regime taking over in the United Kingdom, as we saw in America on January the 6th.
Well, yeah, I'm also seeing today's news, and I'm looking at the language that Donald Trump is using, and I just don't know where to go with this. I've got a 20-year-old son, and we're having many discussions now.
Oh, that's good.
And I feel I'm enjoying them, but I feel for his despair of what hope does he have? Everything's broken. It's a whole soap opera.
As the author of How They Broke Britain, Scott, which is currently available in all good bookshops and riding high in the bestsellers chart, I cannot dispute your analysis that everything is broken. However, I can give you some hope, and it's two quite strange words that you're probably not expecting. Amber Rudd. So if you go back just 5 years, you would encounter a period of British politics in which Amber Rudd resigned twice. First as Home Secretary, appropriately enough, because she inadvertently misled the House of Commons about something that had happened under Theresa May's watch, but she felt the burden of ministerial responsibility and the weight of tradition, principle and history on her shoulders. So she resigned as Home Secretary, brought back into the heart of government later as Business Secretary, I think by Johnson. Johnson was certainly in charge when she resigned again, not just as a minister, but she resigned the whip entirely in complete protest at what Boris Johnson was doing. So not only has she been completely vindicated, which isn't pertinent to the question you ask about hope, it reminds us it's not that long ago that even people we disagree with politically were still abiding by the rules that we all should respect. So if we can come so far so quickly in the wrong direction, my hope is that we can go so far so quickly back in the right direction as soon as you've got some adults in charge.
Well, that's how do we get there? Because my concern is now that politics has become our soap opera. It's actually a good week to talk this. If we talk about I'm a celebrity.
Well, yeah, there you go.
That these at Love Island, where we get our entertainment, our politics is actually becoming, in some warped way, the entertainment of what's a soap opera.
Well, that's why it's one of the things I like about Starmer, and there's plenty that I don't like, but I don't think anyone's ever going to accuse him of getting into beauty contests or prioritising shallow posturing over attempts at pragmatism and policy making, albeit that he will get some things wrong. Thank you, Scott. And regards to your boy as well, you see, that gives me hope. He's more politically engaged than he would be if we were living in a good period. It's 11:33. I apologise. We go to Holly Harris for the headlines a little late.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:37 is the time. It's interesting to note the full list of things that would be breached by that Rwanda deportation scheme. It's the United Nations Convention on Torture, the Refugee Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All of these would be breached by the Rwanda policy. Crucially, it is therefore not only the European Convention on Human Rights, which is relevant to this case, as is sometimes thought. So these are the international treaties that maintain a veneer, at least, of civilization. I appreciate that recent events may have made some people wonder precisely what restrictions or regulations are in place with regard to what sovereign countries can do, but these are the things that protect civilians, supposedly, citizens, supposedly, sometimes from their own governments. The UN Convention on Torture, the Refugee Convention, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. More than 50 Tory MPs, Sam Coates at Sky reports, backed an amendment to actually disapply all of these international laws. So you'd become a country that was flying solo when it comes to protections of civilians and citizens from potential malfeasance by their own government. I mean, that's just grim. The list is gross. Sir John Hayes, Suella Braverman's mentor, Sir William Cash, David Jones, Marcus Fish. He rang me once. You should look it up on YouTube. Greg Smith, John Redwood, inevitably. Craig McKinley. This must be from a while ago because Andrew Bridgen's on the list. And there's our friend, Brendan Clark Smith, the fellow who's currently deploying Nazi-style language to go after the judges who've handed down this decision, and the list continues. So that was I forget precisely when it was, but they were seeking to effectively abandon everything that covers what could be loosely described as civilian protections. In fact, I would say next time you hear the phrase human rights, just translate it in your own head to civilian protections, citizen protections, and possibly it would do the job that it's designed to do, that people who denigrate or mock human rights have rather successfully polluted in recent years. 11:39 is the time. I'll talk to Matt in Manchester, and then I've got something quite entertaining for you, I think, potentially. But no, actually, I'll do that first. Should I do that? No, Matt, quickly, it'll have to be. What would you like to say?
Hi. Sunak will be gone in a few weeks now. They've been basically gaslighting us on this supposed idea, stroke policy for a year. It was never really meant to be implemented.
That's very true. I don't think you're right about Sunak, but that is very, very true. So Johnson turns to Patel and says, these small boats are a problem. Can we do anything about it? And Patel says, well, no, not really. We've closed all the safe routes. So it's literally the only way these people can get into this country, and the countries they're passing through are already dealing with more applications than we are. So Johnson said, well, we need to do something that makes it look like we're trying to fix it. And then, where we're going to send them all to Rwanda. And it doesn't matter that that's almost certain to fail, because we can spend the next year or two saying, well, we're just waiting for the Rwanda ruling to come through, you see.
That's
Pure Johnson.
Exactly what... basically, Sunak has no intention of doing anything that he says. He's just a stopgap to waste time. I voted for this government, shamefully. We now have two parties where neither leader or neither front bench plan to do anything that most of the supporters want.
Well, that's an interesting... You've teed up PMQs quite nicely there. The second caller in succession who is bringing their dissatisfaction with Keir Starmer into a conversation about a Tory disaster, which some days I might be minded to tick people off for doing that. But if it happens twice in succession, then it has to be a thing, doesn't it? I'm going to crack on, Matt, because I've got the extremely esteemed trade negotiator, former Australian trade negotiator, Dmitry Grozobinski, on the line, and he will have world leaders and sundry other Lord High Panjandrams importuning him for comment and conversation as we speak. And I don't want to lose him. The reason I wanted to talk to you today, Dmitry, is because I read in the Daily Mail that Kemi Badenoch, and I did suggest not long ago that she was going to follow Liz Truss's lead of announcing largely meaningless so-called trade agreements and portraying them to the Tory faithful and the media cultists, the client media, as astonishing achievements, the like of which we have never seen before and certainly could not have undertaken without leaving the European Union. I mentioned that apropos nothing in particular because I noticed that Kemi Badenoch has credited Brexit for enabling her to sign a major trade deal with Florida. How excited should we be?
I mean, I think we've probably spoken about this more than it deserves in that.
You've only been on for 3 seconds. You've only been on for 3 seconds.
Yeah, that's about 3 seconds longer than I really should have been on for something like this. I mean, I'm looking at the text in front of me, and let me steelman this. Let me be as fair as I can to this.
Please.
It does absolutely no harm. It is the government of the UK and the government of Florida, which is a big state,
yes,
signing a document that basically just goes, let's just look and see if in the future there's some ways that we can be more helpful. It commits to things like going, hey, if we see some market access barriers, we will think about doing something about them.
Yes.
Let's do more virtual and in-person trade missions to one another's territory. Let's see if we can work with our private and public sector to see if we can facilitate some introductions. Let's facilitate introductions for investors from Florida and from the UK to one another to see if we can create some investment. It legally binds both sides to do nothing, and there is in fact a section that explicitly states that this does not entail anyone spending any money. So no one is going to spend any money and no one is bound to do anything, but everyone broadly agrees on both sides that trade is good and it would be nice if there were more of it.
So, I mean, even Kemi Badenoch presumably realises that nobody qualified or even vaguely informed is going to be impressed by this, but the editor of the Daily Mail describes it as a major trade deal.
Which was, I think, the point. This is like something out of Tufton Street. The headline was the point. The substance is completely tertiary. This creates a signing ceremony. It allows them to, they will, as they already have, I don't know if this was the Daily Mail or one of your other fine press institutions, but someone already described this as something like a $1.3 trillion deal, a figure they arrived at by just taking the GDP of Florida and announcing that this sort of broad agreement to be friends will apparently deliver that entire value.
Oh, you missed the crucial.
UK.
You missed the crucial point, Dimitri, which is not like you, because of course that 1.3 trillion pounds, that's more than most European countries.
Absolutely, and now all of it will be flowing to the UK. I'm sure the check is in the mail.
Absolutely.
You will all be receiving your share. I mean, listen, this is fundamentally, I think, the cynical view of this is that you have two actors, one being Ron DeSantis, who is desperately trying to shore up his foreign policy credentials ahead of coming forth in the Iowa caucus, and you have Kemi Badenoch, who is running out of free trade agreements she can sign, and is certainly not going to get one with the U.S., which doesn't want one with the U.K. or with anyone, and both of them looking to be able to have a signing ceremony and look like they did something, and this is technically qualifies as something.
I think is the technical term a memorandum of understanding?
Exactly.
Well, can we sign one now? Because I now understand this a lot better than I did before. I'd like to formalise that, if I may, Dimitri.
As long as it's not legally binding and neither of us is obliged to spend any money, I'm willing to enter into discussions for a signing ceremony with you, James.
It is absolutely meaningless. I'll get Eleanor to give you a ring next week and we'll sign a memo of understanding together. And with
I look forward to the Daily Mail headline about it.
And with lots of photographers present as well.
Wonderful.
Dimitri Kozovinsky there, founder of explaintrade.com, which, as I think he's just demonstrated in rather spectacular fashion, does exactly what it says on the tin. He cut his teeth, of course, as a trade negotiator for the Australian government. 11:46 is the time. So, listen, I know it's a bit I told you so, which I never say, but when I told you what Kemi Badenoch was going to do, and I told you that it would involve doing exactly what Liz Truss did to persuade the Conservative Party membership that she was producing something good when she was producing something utterly meaningless, I didn't expect her to prove me right in quite such spectacular fashion. And along comes Ted Verity, the editor of the Daily Mail, to give her the headline she wants. Kemi hails Brexit as she signs trade deal with Florida. Just a couple of problems with that headline. Number one, it isn't a trade deal. Number two, I don't actually know whether you would need to have left the European Union to sign a memorandum of understanding. That's something I can clear up with Dimitri when we sign our own memo of understanding in front of the world's, the Daily Mail's photographer next week. It's 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 12 is the time. I touched yesterday upon the curious relationship that we have with religion in this country, in that people who don't seem to really abide by what we could loosely describe as Christian values profess outrage whenever Christian values are apparently under threat, and yet stay completely silent when the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the most senior cleric in the Church of England, of course, which remains the national religion, speaks out on various issues. Yesterday, for example, it was on the need for a ceasefire in Gaza, which would put him at odds with both the Conservative Party and the Labour leadership. And today he has spoken up on the Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court's ruling on the government's Rwanda policy. Justin Welby says, and it's quite interesting this, there is much that the government and Church of England agree on when it comes to Britain's asylum policy. We are clear that we cannot have open borders, that we cannot take everyone, and that we must stop people risking their lives crossing the channel in small boats. We agree that we must stop the people smugglers. But the Church has also been clear in our profound concerns, moral and practical, about outsourcing our obligations to refugees to Rwanda. We have been clear that the inefficiencies of our asylum system and its failure to treat all people with compassion and dignity must be addressed. And that there it is. Suella Braverman and many like her in the Conservative Party and the wider public are absolutely uninterested in treating all people with compassion and dignity. That's not an opinion. That's just counting. They revel sometimes, it seems. The photograph of Braverman in Rwanda, cackling for the camera is evidence of this. They revel in the removal of compassion and dignity. They celebrate the removal of compassion and dignity. And the Archbishop goes on, today's decision by the Supreme Court leaves our response to desperate people fleeing conflict and persecution in a state of limbo. I hope this judgment will give the opportunity to reflect and reconsider its approach. And he closes, there's a lot more, but I won't read it all. He closes with a quote from Matthew, where Jesus says to his disciples, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. In a world where so many are suffering in conflict, persecution and extreme poverty, the Archbishop concludes, I pray that we keep these words in mind. Yesterday, of course, the great defenders of Christian values were getting very cross about a calendar that the National Trust had issued that didn't contain the dates of Christmas and Easter. It was a inclusivity calendar designed to address the festivals that are not ordinarily at our fingertips or things of which we are immediately aware. And just because I increasingly feel somebody has to, I had a little look yesterday at the National Trust website to see if there was any basis to the claim that the National Trust was essentially seeking to cancel Christmas, no less. Well, it was a bit of an odd experience, actually, because all I did was click on the National Trust website and then go to the bit that says Christmas, because I don't know about you, I heard it on my radio yesterday, I read it in my newspapers, all sorts of evidence being offered up that the National Trust was woke and it needed to be nipped in the bud, and it was categorically dedicated to cancelling Christmas. So just, off the top of my head, here are a few things that you can do with the National Trust this Christmas. You've got a large list of the Christmas lights and winter illuminations, all of which involve National Trust sites that are going to be transformed with colour on a Christmas 2023 lights trail. You can book tickets for that on the website. You can visit Father Christmas at a variety of grottos up and down the country, because of course he works extremely hard in the run up to the festive season. You can do that. Historic houses are being decked out for Christmas. You can step back in time and experience a historic Christmas firsthand. You can see houses decked out with decorations from across history and be transported right back to the festivities of the time. Christmas markets, winter fairs abound at National Trust sites this season. Perfect Christmas presents available there, or you can stock up on your seasonal treats and decorations at a Christmas market or winter fair. You can join a Christmas craft workshop to learn how to create colourful decorations and memorable gifts. 17th century Christmas at Moseley Old Hall, a 1960s Christmas at Chastleton, a 1970s Christmas at Lamb House, a Christmas journey to the North Pole at Mottisfont, a community Christmas in Comer Woods, a fairy tale Christmas at Polesden Lacey, a Georgian Christmas at Quebec House, a magical Christmas with Gibbside, a Neverland Christmas at Himpton Ampner, a Nutcracker Christmas at Nyman's, a Storybook Christmas at Chartwell, an Ants Christmas at Emmett's Garden, a Below Stairs experience at Osterley Park, book to see the Christmas lights at Tringwainton, Buckland Abbey Christmas, celebrate Christmas together at Kingston Lacey. I could actually, and I won't because Natasha has arrived, I could go on, but what I would do instead is just ask you to refer anybody who spent yesterday telling you that the National Trust was threatening or cancelling Christmas, that if they'd clicked on the National Trust homepage for just 30 seconds, they would, on the very first screen, have found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43 mentions of Christmas on the first screen alone. But whatever you do, don't let the woke mob at the National Trust cancel Christmas. Alternatively, you could start questioning whether the people telling you to get cross about this, who also, of course, told you to vote for Brexit and that Boris Johnson would be a brilliant Prime Minister, perhaps it's time to start taking what they tell you with a pinch of salt. Speaking of Prime Ministers, Natasha, I don't think I'm going to give you any prizes today for predicting what... Well, I just think that we can probably have a fair crack at guessing what Keir Starmer's going to open with.
It's ridiculous.
I'm sorry, that's the way it works.
Okay, fine. Well, we don't need to predict exactly what's going to happen at PMQs, do we? We all know that everything is going to be dominated by the Supreme Court row, which has erupted this morning. I've just come from the Supreme Court where I watched the judge give down this judgment. I've got it right in front of me if you'd like to read it later in the break. It's very long. It's very damning. The Rwanda policy is dead in the water to this lunchtime, I think. I think it's fair to say the government are looking at next steps, but I don't see how Rwanda... And I think we were talking earlier about what wriggle room the government have. It's not Rwanda. It's going to be the government looking, I think, to other deals with other countries instead. Their argument this morning, we've had a statement from the Prime Minister, is that the idea of sending refugees to third countries was not ruled to be illegal by the Supreme Court. So their answer...
safe, as long as they're safe.
As long as they're safe. So their answer is, OK, well, let's look at other countries to see whether that could be something we could do instead.
The problem there being, perhaps, that the safer a country is, the more likely it is to be dealing with its own asylum applications already, because the appeal of Rwanda, if you like, was that it hardly had any, and therefore they'd be quite keen to process ours. There is another alternative, which the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party seems to be offering up at the moment. I speak, of course, of 30p Lennox. He says the government should ignore the Supreme Court ruling and send migrants straight back. He doesn't specify where. He says put the planes in the air, ignore the laws and send them straight back. Now, Rishi Sunak sacked Suella Braverman yesterday. If you've got a Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, traditionally the party of law and order, I believe, saying ignore the laws, in normal times, that would probably be a sackable offence as well.
It is, and it's not just him. There was actually an amendment put down by another MP, Jonathan Gullis, earlier this year in the illegal migration bill when they were discussing that, which said, and this is actually an interesting point, the Supreme Court earlier today said that even if we leave the ECHR, there are plenty of other laws, both in British and European law, that we would have to consider and we have to abide by. And this amendment by Jonathan Gullis that was brought forward, I think signed by up to 60 Conservative MPs, would be to override all of these laws. It is something.
All of them. Convention on torture, torch it.
A lot.
Get rid of it. Don't know. Who cares? Send them back to places where people are tortured, where we know they're tortured, but we should send them there anyway, because they're foreign. Let's just do it. Let's just do it. I'm reminded again of the words of the Archbishop of Canterbury about the importance of treating people with compassion and dignity. It is hard to think of a clearer demonstration of some people's determination to never treat these people with compassion and dignity than precisely the amendment you refer to. Well, let's go now, shall we, to Rishi Sunak and see what he's saying first.
There are further elements that they want additional certainty on, and noted that changes can be delivered in the future to address those issues. The government has been working already on a new treaty with Rwanda, and we will finalise that in light of today's judgment. And furthermore, if necessary, I am prepared to revisit our domestic legal frameworks. Let me assure the House, my commitment to stopping the boats is unwavering. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will be making an oral statement shortly to the House. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister
I think we can spare ourselves that treat. We will return to the House of Commons as soon as the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, gets to his feet. We're confident that all 6 questions will be on Rwanda, are we? Because, I mean, well, or there or thereabouts, because Suella Braverman probably merits a bit of a mention as well, doesn't she?
Yeah, I think that just ties into the big debate, doesn't it? I think we could assume that all of them would be on migration. The only other thing that I think Sir Keir Starmer could mention, but I probably would say he won't, is inflation. And Rishi Sunak will claim that as a win today. But Sir Keir Starmer will say, well, prices are still rising and the cost of living crisis is still huge.
Rishi Sunak did a great deal to drive down international energy prices, did he?
No, he probably did not. So yes, obviously trying to claim that inflation is something that government control is a bit of a risky one.
We can all agree that if the sun comes out this afternoon, that will be a result of Rishi Sunak's policies.
Absolutely, yes. I think he's made real progress in this area. I just wanted to pick up on what Rishi Sunak said earlier, just a minute ago. He said, I was told last night by some people in Number 10 that they are considering a treaty with Rwanda. Rishi Sunak just confirmed that just now. He said, we have already been working on a treaty with Rwanda, which will come forward soon. So confirmation that is something that the government have been looking at, this legally binding agreement, which could potentially get around some of those legal pitfalls. But as I said to you earlier, I just don't think that Rwanda, is going to be safe enough as a country to get past any of those.
You came very close there to saying a legally binding agreement that would allow the government to circumvent the actual laws.
Sure, yeah, but that's it. Well, that's it. That is exactly what it would do. It sounds. I know it sounds crazy, but to be fair, laws are complicated mismatch of European law, British law, treaties, and they all compete with each other. And the Supreme Court has obviously made its ruling today.
Okay,
but if they were
let's go. Hang on, finish that. Hold that thought.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister obviously thinks so little of his own MPs that he's had to peel David Cameron away from his 7-year exile in a shepherd's hut and make him Foreign Secretary. But a few months ago, the Intelligence and Security Committee said that the now Foreign Secretary's role in a Chinese investment fund may have been, and this is their words, engineered by the Chinese state. I hardly need to remind the Prime Minister of the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party or the intimidation against members of this House. So when will he instruct the Foreign Secretary to give full public disclosure of his work for Chinese interests?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'm delighted that the former Prime Minister has rejoined government as Foreign Secretary. As an individual with unrivalled experience, he will help Britain navigate an uncertain world in challenging times. Of course, like every other government minister, he will go through the normal process with the independent advisor. But the government's position on China is clear. China represents an epoch-defining challenge. That's why we have taken strong and robust steps to protect ourselves against the risk that it poses. But we'll take no lessons, Mr. Speaker, from the Labour Party on protecting our national security. They've taken almost £700,000 from an alleged Chinese agent.
Mr. Speaker,
Sorry? Yes, I think now you're on the front bench. We need to just calm down. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, for someone who spent the last few weeks complaining about recycling bins, it's ironic that his latest reset involves recycling the architects of 13 years of Tory failure. But this is the Prime Minister who also reanimated the career of the member for Fareham in order to resuscitate his own just days after she was sacked for a national security breach. Is he ashamed that he was so desperate to become Tory leader, so scared to face a vote, that he put someone so totally unfit for office in charge of Britain's national security?
Mr. Speaker, he mentions 13 years. We remember what happened at the beginning of that 13 years. It was this party that restored this country's financial security after the Labour Party left no money behind, Mr. Speaker. And it is a bit rich to take lectures on security from a man who wanted to make the former member for Islington North Prime Minister of our country.
The member for Islington North isn't even a Labour MP anymore. A changed party and strong leadership. Mr.
Speaker. Luke, with a lot of business today, very important business with some important votes, and I want to get through this speedily. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, for 13 years our security has been undermined by this Tory government. And now the most ridiculous, pathetic spectacle of all. His Rwanda scheme, cooked up with his National Security Threat Home Secretary, has blown up. He was told over and over again that this would happen, that it wouldn't work, and it was just the latest Tory gimmick. But he bet everything on it, and now he's totally exposed. The central pillar of his government has crumbled beneath him. Does he want to apologise to the country for wasting £140 million of taxpayer cash and wasting his entire time in office?
Mr. Speaker, obviously the person officer didn't hear what I said about our approach to Rwanda, and not least when it comes to stopping the boats. Rwanda is one part of our plan which has already delivered a reduction in the number of small boats this year by a third, Mr. Speaker. But he talks about apologising. He talks about the former member not being a Labour MP now. Yes, he wasn't a Labour MP when he declined 15 different times to say that Hamas was a terrorist organisation this week, which is shameful. But he was a Labour MP. Indeed, the honourable gentleman served with him. He told the country he would make a great Prime Minister. At that point, he described Hamas as friends. Does he want to apologise for that now?
Are we serious?
No.
Because I'm going to tell you... Oh, I wouldn't challenge. Because I've got to say, our constituents are watching this. They're very, very concerned about the affairs of today. They're very concerned about the votes later. A lot of members wish to speak. Those who don't want that to happen, please, go outside, go and have a conversation.
As a general rule, the sooner Rishi Sunak reaches for Jeremy Corbyn, the more desperate he is. And on this occasion, he's not only reached for him very early, but repeatedly.
And while he was wasting his time on this gimmick, the asylum backlog has swollen to 175,000 people. Taxpayers are paying £8 million a day on hotel bills, and 615 people arrived by small boat last Sunday alone. Plan A has failed. And after this session, whether he likes it or not, he'll have to go back to his office, back to the drawing board, and start from scratch. Can he assure the British public that he will drop what his former Home Secretary calls his magical thinking and start treating small boat crossings with the seriousness that they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about a changed Labour Party. Perhaps we'll see that this evening. He can't even make his party do the right thing when it comes to standing by Israel in the vote later today. He talks about taking small boats crossing seriously. He's opposed every single measure that we have taken, Mr. Speaker. Again, let me update him on what we've done this year. The number of illegal Albania arrivals down by 90%. 20,000 people returned this year. The number of crossings down by a third. He mentioned hotels, closing 50 of them. Money being saved for taxpayers. All, by the way, opposed by the party opposite. What is the honourable gentleman's plan? Yes, there we have it. A cosy deal with the EU, which would see the UK accept 100,000 illegal migrants. He doesn't want to stop the boats. He wants to welcome more of them.
Mr. Speaker, it's very straightforward. He promised that he would stop the boats this year. This year. Today is the 15th of November. He's wasted all of his time on a gimmick, and now he's absolutely nowhere. Will he level with the British public and finally admit he's failed to deliver on his promise?
Mr. Speaker, this government has done more to tackle illegal migration than any in the past. And again, let's just review, Mr. Speaker. He's been on the wrong side of this issue his entire career. This is a man who described all immigration law as racist. He said it was a mistake to control immigration, and he has never once in this place voted for stricter asylum rules. It's clear, Mr. Speaker, while he might want to listen to the open border activists, I'm siding with the British people.
I would have thought if he was confident about his promise, he would have given an answer saying he stands by it and will deliver by the end of the year. But the absence of that answer is absolutely amazing in the circumstances. He's had 3 reshuffles, a forgotten conference speech, an empty King speech. He even found time to fanboy Elon Musk. but not one of them has made the slightest difference to the lives of working people. If we had £1 for every time we had a reset, the cost of living crisis would be over long ago. Now, he likes to think of himself as the man from Silicon Valley, the tech-savvy Californian, the country's first AIPM. And yet his big idea is to keep turning his government on and off and hope at the wall and hope that we'll see signs of life. Is he starting to feel that, as somebody once said, he was the future once?
I slightly missed the end of that, but I've got to say, I was glad to hear finally that the Honourable Gentleman did bring up the cost of living, because on that he is right. That is the number one challenge facing countries up and down the family. And today, he mentioned it, but what he failed to recognise, and he talked about delivering on promises, today was a day that we delivered on the most important pledge I make to halve inflation, Mr. Speaker. Delivering on a commitment, easing the burden for families up and down the country. What we would see from the party opposite is everything would jeopardise that progress, borrowing £28 billion a year, undermining our energy security, giving in to inflation-busting pay rises to his union backers. That's not a sensible plan, Mr. Speaker. It would push up mortgage rates, push up inflation, harm working families. All the while, we're going to continue delivering for the country.
And now for something completely different, question 4.
We are. Prime Minister.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure my honourable friend will be delighted that the West Midlands now tops regional rankings for foreign direct investment. The government is also significantly investing in the region, including hundreds of millions of pounds for Levelling Up Fund and Towns Fund investments, and introducing a new pilot scheme to help businesses in the region become more energy efficient.
Sir Michael.
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for that encouraging answer? And on behalf of my constituents in Lichfield, may I thank him for having the guts to actually stop HS2. But can I ask that the area within my constituency in the north, where construction is still going on, that this happens swiftly, and that those areas which are not going to have HS2, compensation is also made swiftly to those people who are expecting it.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question, but also for his consistent campaigning on this issue, and I recall his last question at Prime Minister's Questions on this very topic. I'd like to reassure him that we are committed to fair treatment for people affected by the changes, whilst also protecting taxpayers appropriately. Wherever property has been acquired for HS2, property owners have been fully compensated, and any outstanding cases will be settled. We are developing a programme to sell the surplus land on HS2 Phase 2 and ensure that it delivers value for money, does not disrupt local property markets, and I'll ensure that the Rail Minister talks and meets with him swiftly on behalf of his constituents.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the then Prime Minister and now Foreign Secretary David Cameron said that people in Gaza are living under constant attacks and pressure in an open-air prison. Does the current Prime Minister not agree that if there is not an immediate ceasefire, then all of us in this chamber will be watching on as that open-air prison is turned into a graveyard?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no one can deny the suffering that the people in Gaza are undergoing at the moment. I spoke about this on Monday, and I spoke about it consistently with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, which is why we're doing everything we can to get aid into the region, and we have repeatedly and consistently called for humanitarian pauses to get aid in and to get hostages and those that need to get out, foreign nationals, as quickly as possible, and will continue, as the Foreign Secretary will do, to make sure that that happens.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, how much worse does it need to get? 4,609 children are already dead in Gaza. Babies in the neonatal intensive care unit are dying because they don't have access to oxygen. For members across the House, this is a question of values, and it is a question of conscience. So does the Prime Minister not agree that should there be a vote on an immediate ceasefire, that members across the House should be afforded a free vote?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, our position as the government is clear on this. It's right that Israel is able to defend itself, and that principle is one which we support. It has suffered an appalling terrorist attack. Hamas is a terrorist organisation, and it is not just Israel's right but duty to protect its citizens. At the same time, we have consistently at the United Nations and bilaterally with all our partners called for humanitarian pauses to ensure that more aid can get in, hostages and nationals can get out. That's the right thing to do. We will continue to do everything we can to alleviate the suffering that the Palestinian people are undergoing, and I'm confident that our efforts are already making a big difference on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kirklees Council have closed Dewsbury Sports Centre, delivered just 14% of
not Dewsbury Sports Centre, is it? Well, we may catch up on that a little later, but we will pick over the exchanges between the Prime Minister and the leaders of the SNP and the Labour Party after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 12 is the time, so we are, I suppose in some ways, the Rwandan ruling, Natasha Clark, has knocked the inflation claims a little bit out of the news, albeit that they're almost as spurious as Kemi Badenoch's new trade deal with Florida, but also pushed Keir Starmer's looming problems with the ceasefire vote into the background, but in the second case, at least, only for now.
Yeah, we are expecting to see later today a bit of a clash in the House of Commons when this Gaza-Israel SNP debate comes forward. Labour have tried to get on the front foot on this by bringing forward their own motion, but it still stops short of calling for a ceasefire. So there are so many Labour MPs that are looking at this motion today going, am I going to vote for this or am I going to vote for the SNP one, which goes further in causing a ceasefire? And, you know, we've heard from Labour figures this morning refusing to rule out the possibility that Keir Starmer might sack them if they do.
So the numbers would be crucial, really, because he can't sack 30 people, can he? But he could perhaps sack 3.
For sure. And obviously it depends on whether the Speaker calls both of those amendments and whether he considers that they're too similar and he just puts one of them to a vote. So it's a lot of technical Commons procedure to wait for. But yes, that vote will come forward later.
So, as I said during PMQs, the speed with, well, if he reaches for the Jeremy Corbyn button at all, he's desperate. If he reaches for it very early, he's very desperate. And if he reaches for it several times, he's very, very, very desperate. And it was very much the final category that Rishi Sunak found himself in today.
It was. I think it was 6 minutes in. I looked at the clock. And, you know, like I say, he didn't just mention him once. He mentioned him several times. And, you know, I think we agree that he appeared incredibly rattled today. He's obviously not having a good morning, is he? The Prime Minister losing.
Bad 24 hours, really.
Pretty poor. And yes, it knocks obviously his lovely inflation news out of the window as well. His promise to halve inflation, which again we both agree that the government doesn't have a lot of say over, but still the Prime Minister decided to make inflation one of his 5 priorities and took a bit of a gamble on it, but it was one that has paid off. It has gone down. Energy prices have gone down. It will be putting slightly it won't even be putting slightly more money in people's pockets, will it? Because inflation is coming down, but it's still at 4.6%. So
and
still
food
things
much
are going
higher.
up.
Food still around the 10% mark. So he didn't go straight in on Rwanda, which I think turned out to be quite a clever tactic.
It did, and obviously, you know, if you're Keir Starmer, you have an array of topics to go on today. True. You've got, what do you go on? Do you go on Suella Braverman? Do you go on David Cameron? Do you go on Rwanda? And actually, he went on all of them, which obviously all tie together quite nicely. And I thought some of his jokes were very good, actually.
Yes, they were this week.
So Keir Starmer's jokes are very hit and miss, I feel, but these ones were pretty good. Ending on the famous David Cameron quote, "He was the future once," which was the way that David Cameron signed off his final Prime Minister's questions back in 2016 when he quit over the Brexit vote. So yes, that landed quite well. I don't think Rishi actually heard it. I don't think he was listening. He didn't actually get it. But yes, I thought Sir Keir Starmer was pretty good today, and Rishi was obviously on the back foot. He was never going to be having a great PMQs today with what.
But he also didn't even try to answer the question about David Cameron's ties to China and fairly profound concerns about them that have been reported. He would have been aware of that. Does he just bank on the fact that it won't get anything like the sort of attention that, for example, Keir Starmer's curry in Durham got? You know, because that's obviously much more important than a foreign secretary being uncomfortably close to what is widely regarded as a rogue regime.
Sure, I think For Rishi, he was clearly in diversionary tactic mode today. He just wanted to shove every single criticism aside and do the classic politician whataboutery. Let's talk about something else. What about this? What about this? You've not voted for this. You've not voted for that. That was his tactic. And these questions about David Cameron aren't going to go away. The Greensill lobbying scandal as well, one huge issue, which David Cameron was asked about earlier this week and completely dismissed the question, didn't answer it at all, just said that's in the past. That's not going to be good enough for the government to argue. And yes, his foreign policy views, David Cameron was the man that presided over closening relationship with China.
Yes, exactly.
For so many years, and
Yes.
George Osborne as well. So what is his answer going to be to that?
Well, why did he do it, do you think? Why has he brought Cameron in, just in your view?
I mean, I tried to write a piece on this yesterday, an LBC's Views piece. It took me quite a long time, to be honest with you, to try and sort out why I thought this was a case. I concluded that I think he thinks that, A, he could possibly bring back some of that Tory true blue vote from the Shires. So, Liberal Democrats obviously up in taking on quite a lot of a chunk of the vote in there. And
so he's saying, look, we haven't gone completely mad. I've just rehired David Cameron.
That. And also, despite the ending to David Cameron's premiership, comparatively, it was a more stable premiership than several that we've seen so far. Does he make the argument that actually it's a more stable prime minister, so therefore let's bring him back in to try and put forward this air of we're a bit more professional, the grown-ups are back in the room sort of thing? That's maybe another argument.
So it doesn't have to succeed, does it, for your answer to be right? This could be the plan.
Yeah.
But it could fail. But it remains that was the plan in the first place.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a plan to win him the next election.
No.
I think it's a plan to stabilise government. Also gives him a sense of a confidant. We know that these prime ministers talk to their former prime ministers, on the phone, but now he's going to have him in cabinet. He's going to have him right by his side through some big moments. We've got COP 28 coming up later. If he does sign a potential trade deal with India, he will have David Cameron by his side, hopefully propping up his image on the world stage. Remains to be seen whether that will work or not, but I think those are some of the reasons why Number 10 decided to do this. They said that it was actually the Prime Minister's idea to bring him back, that he had mentioned this more than a week ago. It's one of the best kept secrets in Downing Street I can remember for a very long time.
It did occur to me, looking at the photograph of Cabinet, that most of the people around that table would have been available for David Cameron to appoint when he was Prime Minister, and he wouldn't have gone near them.
Yeah, some of them for sure. What I thought was interesting from that photo that you're looking at in the papers today is that he's directly opposite him. He's clearly going to be a really big part of Rishi Sunak's team.
And then the second question, inevitably, about Suella Braverman. And it, in a way, the more we talk about it, the more I wonder whether actually Sunak didn't do that badly, because it could have been so much worse. Because what he can't do is come out and defend or praise Suella Braverman. Normally, when a minister has resigned or even been sacked, you could say they did a great job, and I'm sorry to lose them, or we've taken a decision to move. But obviously, with her, after she had a hissy fit at him yesterday, he can't really say anything warm about her, which could have left a bigger wound for Starmer to exploit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw yesterday with that letter that Suella Braverman sent, that scathing, fiery, damning letter that she sent. We didn't get a reply from the Prime Minister. No. And that's usually the case, that when someone steps down from government, they have an exchange of letters and the Prime Minister says something lovely.
But if they resign, they do. The sacked people normally have an exchange of letters.
Therese Coffey was a bit of a strange one earlier this week. She, in her resignation letter, said she was resigning, but we all know that Rishi Sunak was thinking about sacking her for a long time and moving her on. So yes, you're right, it doesn't tend to happen when they do get sacked. So we're told that by allies close to Suella Braverman that she's been planning this letter for a little while. I think she could have been a bit pithier in it, to be honest. It could have been chopped down. It was quite long.
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, there's a bit of horse trading as well, isn't there? So you can say, can I tell them that I resigned? And if he really doesn't like you, he'll say, no, you can't, you're fired. But if you've still got a little bit of warmth between you can say, yeah, go on then, tell him you resigned.
Yeah, for sure, exactly. And there was nothing of them between the two. I think the only thing that Number 10 said yesterday was, the Prime Minister thanks her for her service. That was the warmest words that Number 10 could come up with.
What does she do now?
I think she sits back for a little while and considers her next steps, whether that is a leadership challenge. I think we could, we don't know.
Before the election? Is that a possibility? I know Andrea Jenkins thinks it is, but that's normally a reason to believe the polar opposite.
Completely. And Andrea Jenkins this lunchtime saying that she thinks another 6 letters are about to go in.
She should write a book. It's very popular at the moment, and indulge all of her fantasies and delusions in there.
I think Suella starts having conversations with MPs about whether she could be popular enough to become leader of the party, whether that happens before the election or after. I personally don't think it would happen before election.
So she might be able to draw upon most of those MPs that you mentioned earlier who signed the amendment that would remove us from all international obligations when it comes to being a civilised country.
Yeah, and there's 60 of them.
But that would be the absolute ceiling, wouldn't it?
I think so, yeah. I don't think she would get any more than that. And I think she's probably got a core of maybe 20 to 30 core supporters, and the people that signed the amendment are probably from a slightly broader wing of the party. Could she launch a leadership challenge? You'd have to be at the exact right moment, and I don't think we're anywhere near there yet. But for her, I think, she's probably thinking long term, launching a bid after the general election takes place.
And of course, one thinks of Brenda in Bristol, who may have been reacting to a general election famously, but the idea that anyone on the Tory benches think that the country would stomach another Tory
They wouldn't. They absolutely
internecine
wouldn't.
war is yes, of course they. I mean, you'd think they wouldn't, but I suppose people like Jenkins and Braverman left the building a long time ago when it comes to what is feasible, plausible, or rational.
I think for the Prime Minister, he goes for a general election if this all completely crumbles beneath
Sooner
his feet.
rather than later.
Or at some point, he might not have a choice. If he's
So
facing
rather than a vote
leadership
of
challenge.
confidence, you might as well have a general election.
Exactly.
Yeah, let the country, because it might even be marginally more popular in the country than he is in his own parliamentary. No, not him,
Probably
but Braverman. Well, no, neither of them. It's all awful. Why do we bother? Natasha Clark, thank you very much indeed. 12:30 is the time, and Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:34. I'm joined by Sir Jonathan Jones, KC. I still haven't got used to saying KC. Have you got used to saying KC? Well, look at that. Well, epic modesty. It'll never catch on. Former head of the Government Legal Service between 2014 and 2020. And you remember the Attorney Generals under which Jonathan served. It's almost a sort of map of the direction that the successive governments have gone in. We'll talk to him shortly about partly what you're about to hear, which is a quick recap of Rishi Sunak's response to the MP Scott Benton asking what was going to happen next with regard to the Rwanda ruling this morning, because quite widely reported from people citing sources within Downing Street that Plan A has failed, but currently there is no Plan B.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tackling illegal immigration is a crucial issue for my constituents, many of whom will be extremely disappointed at this morning's judgment from the Supreme Court. Is the Prime Minister able to update the House on what this decision means for the government's plan to tackle illegal immigration?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? I know he has championed this issue and it matters to his constituents. As I said, the judgment confirms that the principle of removing asylum seekers to a safe third country is lawful. The government has already been working in advance on a new treaty with Rwanda, which we will finalise in light of today's judgment, so to address the challenges that were raised. But let me say this again. If it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks or international conventions are still frustrating plans at that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships. The British people expect us to do whatever it takes to stop the boats, and that is precisely what this government will deliver.
I come the lead of the opposition.
12:36. Jonathan Jones, thank you for joining us today. What room does he have to address the points he just made? What can he do next?
Well, he's got very little room. It's a very decisive judgment by a unanimous Supreme Court that says the policy is unlawful for a whole load of reasons, but principally because the arrangements for handling refugee claims in Rwanda are said to give rise to a serious risk that people will end up being sent to places where they will be mistreated. And the Supreme Court said that these were serious problems with the system, and therefore, I mean, one option that the PM's touched on is a new treaty, but that treaty would have to overcome the problems that the Supreme Court have identified, and that goes to the way in which claims are handled in Rwanda, but it goes beyond that. It goes to the Supreme Court talked about the culture in the government and public authorities in Rwanda, not really understanding or abiding by the country's international obligations with respect to refugees. So there's a question of culture and general attitude in Rwanda, and the fact that in practice many, many claims are rejected and people are in fact removed to places, to unsafe places. So just changing the words in a treaty or formalising the current memorandum of understanding into a treaty isn't going to solve those real practical problems which the Supreme Court identified. And it would need to do that in order to be proof against any further challenge.
Did the strength of the ruling this morning surprise you somewhat, or not?
No, not really. I mean, the Supreme Court was... I mean, lawyers always say it could go either way, and it kind of could, because you'd had competing rulings in the courts below, but the Supreme Court was agreeing with the majority of the Court of Appeal, and it did so in very clear terms, so that in itself wasn't surprising. The other point that the Supreme Court has stressed is that the legal obstacles to this plan go beyond the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. They lie in a whole set of international law treaties that the UK has signed up to about the treatment of refugees and the UN Treaty Against Torture and so on. So any new steps that the government takes has got to overcome all of that, or has simply got to override them. And that, I guess, is what the PM is talking about when he says that the government will revisit its international law obligations. But what can that mean unless they're prepared positively to disregard them?
So your resignation just over 3 years ago was widely regarded as having been precipitated by Brandon Lewis saying that the government was prepared to break the law in a very, very limited and specific way. This wouldn't be breaking the law in a very limited and specific way. It would be somehow seeking to extract the United Kingdom from the purview of international law. It would.
What's being proposed is legislation in Parliament that would set aside in some way, this word notwithstanding is used. So the legislation would say, these things are to happen, the Rwanda scheme is to have effect, notwithstanding all these other international law instruments and all the other domestic law that currently gives effect to them. That would include the European Convention, but it would include the various UN treaties as well.
Is there any precedent for that from countries other than sort of Russia and North Korea?
Well, there are examples of countries breaking their international law obligations. What would be unusual, and I think unprecedented here, apart from the examples you've already given, would be the UK deliberately setting out in its own legislation to break those treaties. That's what would be required. And in a sense, that would work in our domestic law, because our domestic courts, the UK courts, would be expected to give effect to that legislation. So you could no longer challenge the scheme in our domestic courts, but it would by definition put the UK in breach of all those international law obligations. And that's what a lot of MPs are saying the government should now do.
Extraordinary. Within the ruling, I don't know how much of it you've had time to absorb, it was pretty clear, I think, that ministers were repeatedly being told by civil servants, experts, and one presumes lawyers, that they were on a hiding to nothing, and yet on they pressed. That must have rang some bells.
Well, I don't know what advice was given, but it would be very surprising if ministers weren't told there was at least a risk that they were going to lose. And they did, I mean, as so often the sort of litigation history of this is quite complicated, but in the High Court, 2 judges said the scheme was lawful. The overall scheme was lawful, but the individual decisions hadn't been properly taken. So that was one ruling. Then the majority of the Court of Appeal comes along and says, no, the whole scheme is unlawful, essentially for the reasons that the Supreme Court has agreed with today. And the government will have been advised of those risks. I suppose it will have taken some comfort from the original High Court decision and a dissenting judgment from the Lord Chief Justice in the Court of Appeal that said no, he was prepared to accept the government's assurances and the government's assessment of the situation in Rwanda, and on that basis you've had some judges that were prepared to rule that the scheme was unlawful. But anyway, the whole point of the Supreme Court is that it gives the last word.
It's the
and
full
that's what
stop.
we've had.
It's the final.
Yeah.
What would you advise if they were seeking your advice now on what to do next? I presume they don't ask you questions as broad as that, do they? But can I?
Well, they certainly don't ask me.
No.
But they will be getting lots of expert legal advice on it. I think,
but will they be heeding any of it? I remember when you resigned, Philippe Sands, a very eminent professor of laws, he talked about a decline in the UK's commitment to rule of law. Now, this was in 2020 when much of the madness was still engulfing the country, but these are astonishing. This is astonishing language, and it does seem to be very pertinent to what we're talking about today. So just over 3 years later, it also raises very serious questions about the UK's commitment to rule of law. Could be applied to what we're talking about today.
Well, we'll have to see what they do. I mean, one option would be to abandon this scheme.
Yes.
You might think, because it has been comprehensively ruled to be unlawful. That doesn't sound as though it's what the Prime Minister is proposing to do. The other option is to explore alternatives, so other countries, or conceivably improvements, additional safeguards to the Rwanda scheme, difficult though those will be, that it is at least in theory possible.
Yes.
That
we can render it safe.
Yes, and even the Supreme Court referred to that possibility, although it said that there would be serious obstacles to overcome. The real problem, I think, for the rule of law is the alternative route that some MPs are pressing, which is the one of deliberately breaking our international law obligations and just getting Parliament to say, no, it must happen. And that, I think, would be a crisis for the government. And I don't see how some members of the government, certainly some members of the Tory party, could be prepared to go along with that. So I think that would be that is the crisis option, I think.
So that depends on how much traction that cohort of the Conservative Party gets. And
how willing the PM is to accept, I mean, I don't know, I haven't spoken to her about it, but the resignation of his Attorney General, for example,
yes,
and other members of the government who do, in fact, believe in the rule of law and complying with our international obligations. So I think what we're probably seeing at the moment is a bit of playing for time.
Yes, of course.
And looking at all the options, and that's what you'd expect the government to do when it loses a case. But none of us really know where this will end up.
I mean, it occurs to me that the mess they got themselves into, and with regard to Brexit and the willingness to break international law that prompted your departure from the civil service, was, at least in some ways, a consequence of the vote in 2016. It could have gone differently, it could have gone better, but that is where the problem started. These are problems entirely of the government's own making, aren't they?
Well, the government set itself this objective and made promises about stopping the boats, and a lot of weight was placed on the Rwanda scheme. There is no way, obviously, the Rwanda scheme, even if successful, could on its own stop the boats.
No.
But nonetheless, it was made the kind of totemic policy that would start addressing this problem. That was the government's choice to do all of that. And it must have known, as we've said, that it faced formidable legal risks in doing so, and that's what those chickens have come home to roost.
Indeed, and that would be my final question, Jonathan. What is morale like among those charged with giving legal advice to the government? Because it must have been pretty low in September 2020 when you made for the door. Do you have any insights into what it's like now?
Well, I mean, I haven't been there for 3 years.
You must be in touch with former colleagues.
Yes, I am. I think there have been some tough times, and that obviously was a tough moment. And I didn't leave lightly, and I didn't want to leave. Unfortunately, the immediate problem then went away. I mean, essentially for political reasons. And maybe that's what will happen here. That actually, in the end, the price, both politically and reputationally for the UK, of just chucking away our international law obligations will be too much, and I'm sure the government is getting good, considered legal advice about that.
So you're cautiously optimistic that the people calling for us to abandon our international commitments to things like torture, will prompt Rishi Sunak to go in the right direction.
Well, I hope so.
I hope so too. Look where hope gets us. Jonathan Jones, King's Counsel, many thanks, former head of Government Legal Services and latterly a senior consultant at the law firm Linklaters. It's 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:51 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We've gone a bit legal-tastic today, which I think is the only correct response to a moment of such epic legal significance as the one that we witnessed shortly after 10 o'clock this morning when the Supreme Court announced their rejection of the government's position on the plans to deport refugees and asylum seekers to Rwanda. I think we can say with some confidence that we've got a much clearer understanding collectively of what has happened and why. But there's still room for more illumination and elucidation, leaving aside for the time being the question of whether or not the tweet from 30p Lee Anderson essentially invites people to choose which laws they can and can't obey. And just the more I look at this incredible intervention, the more it looks as if the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party has just sort of declared war on the law or announced that you should ignore the law and do whatever you want if you feel strongly enough about it, which, you know, for a party that not that long ago prided itself, or at least posited itself as the party of law and order, that is a frankly remarkable development. But I mentioned earlier that I wanted to look at something that Adam Wagner, the a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers and someone who's done us enormous favours on various occasions in recent months, had tweeted overnight, which is about something that perhaps Suella Braverman didn't fully understand, what she was giving away in that remarkably pungent and excitable post-sacking letter. It's not, of course, a resignation letter in any traditional sense, because she had been summarily and completely fired. And I hoped, really, Adam, that you would just talk us through it. The idea that, as a previous Attorney General, don't laugh, legal advisor to the government, she would have known the full extent of risk that the government was being led into over this policy.
Yeah, I think that she would have done, and I think the government will have known, and the government will have been advised that this is an extremely risky policy legally, and that it would be very difficult to get through the courts. Now, my thinking on why they would still go ahead is that at the time the policy was developed under Boris Johnson, when Priti Patel was the Home Secretary, there's a way of thinking which was, well, if we win the case, which will inevitably happen, then great, and we'll get this policy off the ground. But if we lose, we can use it as a justification for leaving the European Court of Human Rights, which was always a Dominic Cummings project, and certainly one which various high-up Conservatives, although never a prime minister, have supported. So I think it was a sort of playing a double game always, this policy. Which hasn't actually worked because of the nature of the Supreme Court judgment.
Did you foresee the nature of the Supreme Court judgment? Did you see that they would make it clear that it would have carried even if, or it would have been sustained even if we were no longer in the European Convention of Human Rights, no longer signatories? Yeah,
I mean, that any immigration or asylum lawyer will tell you what the Supreme Court has said. It's not ruled that a sort of new principle that all this non-refoulement is
just reminded everyone what the law is, really, hasn't it?
Well, they've just said, and people have been saying that all along. That this isn't just under the Human Rights Act; it's under the Refugee Convention. It's even under customary international law, which is actually doesn't rely on any treaty or domestic law. So this isn't complicated. And although the question of whether Rwanda was safe, was a matter of fact and a matter of evidence. So it's something that was a bit more difficult to predict. Although many people have said, yeah, of course, Rwanda's not safe for asylum seekers. But this point about, it's not just about human rights is one which is just a very simple legal point. It's not one which required any complex judgment or reasoning.
Well, which makes it perhaps for the average punter all the more remarkable that it has been unspooling for so long, and that there is a bleak reference in the judgment from the court to the idea of ministers being repeatedly told that they were on a hiding to nothing.
Yeah, I don't. I expect we probably will never know what the legal advice was, except that Suella Braverman sort of let the rabbit out of the hat with her letter, essentially saying, "I've been warning you all along that there was a big risk, and you've been warned, and you haven't come up with viable alternatives." And what she really means by that is viable alternatives that would require leaving and undermining various international agreements that we've been part of since just after the Second World War.
Yeah.
So I think that what she's really saying, and as someone who's followed this kind of drama over the internal to the Tory party about whether to leave the European Convention for over a decade, what she's really saying is, why haven't you agreed to do what I want you to do, which is to pull out of all of these conventions? And that's it's really about. It's not about Rwanda. No. It's not even about asylum seekers. It's about, why won't you leave the European Convention on Human Rights and the Refugee Convention, which would be just such a huge blow to the UK internationally, which is why the Prime Minister's not gone with it.
Put us on a footing with Belarus, I think.
Well, not even. I don't know if Belarus has left the Refugee Convention. It's left the European Convention on Human Rights and the Council of Europe.
Lower than Belarus on the
I don't know. But I mean, I'm not even sure. I know that's sort of what people say, but I look at it more as in the sense that the UK was actually really central, particularly after the Second World War, through Winston Churchill, to setting up this international system, which was designed to. It wasn't about giving everybody who's moving around the right to live wherever they want. It was about protecting the most vulnerable people in the world. And the premise of international law was that you can't have what happened in Germany, particularly where Hitler and the Nazis changed the law to make it possible and legal under their system to murder millions of people and to invade other countries. You couldn't just rely on states' internal laws to protect people living within them from bad and evil governments. So, but also, if that doesn't just stop at that particular state, what happened with Germany is they tried to take over the whole of Europe and caused tens of millions of deaths. And so the point of these international rules and laws, which are, work around the margins, is they prevent countries going into the depths of the fascist dictatorships, of the communist dictatorships, at least in principle. And that was the point. That's why Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, that's why they saw them as necessary to preventing another cataclysm like the Second World War. So looking at it, this government, I think, the people in this government want to leave these conventions, are looking at it incredibly narrowly from a very narrow ideological perspective, and they're just not thinking anymore about the wider picture. And I think that's why it's not about embarrassment. It's not about, although it's, we don't want to be in the same category as Russia and Belarus.
Sure.
But there's a better reason for not messing with these conventions, which is that they protect us ultimately from much worse things than people claiming asylum. A few thousand people claiming asylum every year.
It's a brilliantly put, although possibly crediting it to ideology is a little generous on the part of the people prepared, or who were prepared to back that amendment earlier this year. Adam Wagner, thank you so much. Adam's book, Emergency State, which explains how we lost our freedoms in the pandemic and why it matters, is out now. And then there it is. Gosh, what a show. Thank you for keeping me company. We kind of moved with one story throughout. If you missed any of it, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player. We were very expert heavy today, which is always nice on a day of important breaking news, but a position of genuine peril now with regard to the kind of people, including Suella Braverman, that would cut us loose from what you might describe as the safeguards of civilization itself for the international community. You can listen back, pause, rewind live radio on the official LBC app. You'll also find all of LBC's shows there to catch up on. Pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4 on LBC, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.